what if the most dangerous place in the Bible is the one nobody talks about? Most believers grow up hearing about Eden, the garden where humanity began. They learn about the flood, the Exodus, the promised land, but there exists another location, mentioned briefly and then abandoned by Scripture, that holds secrets the traditional Bible never fully revealed. Genesis 4:16, after murdering his brother Abel, was banished to a place called Nod, somewhere east of Eden. That single verse is all most Christians ever learn about this mysterious land. But what if the silence surrounding Nod is not accidental? What if this place holds keys to understanding fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and a parallel civilization that may still influence our world today? Most people assume the Bible tells us everything we need to know about Cain's punishment and exile. But ancient texts preserved by the Ethiopian Church reveal a story far more complex and disturbing than Western Christianity ever acknowledged. In this investigation, we will move through 3 critical discoveries. First, we will uncover what the Ethiopian Bible actually says about Nod and why these texts were kept from mainstream believers for centuries. Second, we will examine the beings who inhabited Nod before Cain arrived and the knowledge they passed to his descendants. And third, we will explore evidence suggesting that Nod was never just a geographical location, but a spiritual dimension that continues to exist in ways that touch our modern world. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The traditional biblical account presents Cain's story with stark simplicity. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy. God curses Cain to wander the earth. God places a mark on Cain to protect him from vengeance. Cain departs to the land of Nod. He builds a city. His descendants are listed briefly. Then the narrative moves on to Seth's lineage and eventually Noah. This simplified version dominated Christian teaching for nearly 2,000 years. It painted Cain as a cautionary tale about the consequences of sin, nothing more. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in continuous existence, preserved a different collection of texts. These writings include the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Adam and Eve, all considered fully canonical by Ethiopian believers. Within these texts, the story of Nod expands dramatically. What the Western Bible dismisses in a single verse, the Ethiopian scriptures explore across chapters filled with disturbing detail. According to these ancient sources, Nod was not simply a region east of Eden where Cain happened to settle. It was a specific kind of place, already prepared, already waiting. The name itself carries meaning often lost in translation. Nod comes from a Hebrew root meaning to wander, to shake, to move restlessly without peace. But Ethiopian interpretations add another layer. They describe Nod as the place where God's presence does not reach, a territory outside divine protection and divine law. Imagine a land where the rules governing Eden no longer applied, where the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms grew thin, where beings from other dimensions could cross over more easily than anywhere else on Earth. This was Nod, not just a place of exile, but a threshold, a doorway, a crack in creation itself. When Cain arrived in Nod, he did not arrive alone, in the sense we might imagine. Yes, he was physically separated from his parents Adam and Eve, from his murdered brother's blood crying from the ground, from the immediate presence of God. But according to Ethiopian texts, Cain was met in Nod by others, not other humans, for the Bible tells us Adam and Eve were the first, not animals. Though the land surely had those, Cain encountered beings the texts call the sons of twilight, the eyes that watch, and later, the watchers themselves. These were entities that existed in that strange borderland between heaven and earth. Angels who had already begun to fall but had not yet fully committed to rebellion. Nod became their gathering place, their sanctuary, their experimental ground, and Cain, marked and cursed, became their first human student. This is where the story diverges most dramatically from what most Christians know. We think of Cain as a wanderer, suffering under God's curse, living out his days in misery and regret. But the Ethiopian texts paint a different picture. They describe Cain as a founder, a builder, a man who gained knowledge forbidden to other humans. The mark God placed on Cain was not merely a sign warning others not to harm him. According to these ancient traditions, the mark functioned as a kind of spiritual antenna, opening Cain's perception to realities that remained hidden from ordinary human consciousness. He could see things others could not see. He could hear voices others could not hear. He could learn from teachers who existed between worlds. And what he learned, he passed to his children, who passed it to their children, creating a lineage of humans who possessed knowledge that should never have left the heavenly realms. But here is the question that should stop us cold. If Cain was the first murderer, if he was cursed and exiled, why does the Bible tell us he built a city? Cities require populations. Cities require organization, technology, resources, cooperation. Who lived in Cain's city? Where did they come from? The traditional Bible offers no clear answer, creating a gap that has puzzled scholars for millennia. But the Ethiopian texts suggest something that most church authorities found too disturbing to accept. They suggest that Cain's descendants were not entirely human, that the beings who taught Cain and Nod also mixed with his family line, that the first city built by human hands was actually a hybrid civilization, part human, part something else, existing in a place where the normal laws of God's creation no longer held full authority. And if that is true, then everything we thought we knew about early biblical history must be reconsidered. Subscribe now, because what comes next will challenge everything your church never told you. Chapter 2: The Curse That Opened Eyes. The mark of Cain remains one of the most debated symbols in biblical scholarship. Traditional interpretations treat it as a simple protective sign, a visible indicator that killing Cain would result in sevenfold vengeance. Sunday school lessons present it as evidence of God's mercy, even toward a murderer. But this interpretation barely scratches the surface of what ancient texts reveal. The Ethiopian Book of Adam and Eve describes the mark in terms that sound less like mercy and more like transformation. According to this text, when God marked Cain, something fundamental changed in how Cain experienced reality itself. His eyes were opened, but not in the way Adam and Eve's eyes were opened when they ate the forbidden fruit. This was a different kind of sight, a perception that reached into dimensions hidden from normal human awareness. The text describes Cain's immediate experience after receiving the mark. He felt a burning sensation across his forehead that spread through his entire body. His vision blurred and then cleared, but what he saw when it cleared was not the same world he had known before. The air itself appeared different, filled with subtle movements and shadows that had always been there but invisible to human eyes. He heard sounds at frequencies his ears had never detected. He sensed presences around him, watching, waiting, interested. The mark did not merely protect Cain from physical harm, it initiated him into a level of reality that even his father Adam, who had walked with God in Eden, had never fully perceived. Cain had become something between human and spirit, marked not just on his flesh, but in the structure of his consciousness itself. This transformation explains what happened next, in ways the simplified biblical account never could. Genesis tells us Cain went to Nod and somehow built a city, but it never explains where he gained the knowledge to do so. Remember, Cain was only the second generation of humans ever to exist. There were no previous cities to study, no architectural traditions to draw from, no engineering knowledge passed down from earlier civilizations. Adam and Eve had lived in a garden, not an urban center. Yet Cain, the farmer and murderer, suddenly possesses the ability to design and construct a city complex enough to house a growing population. Where did this knowledge come from? The Ethiopian texts provide the answer that traditional Christianity tried to bury. Cain was taught. He had instructors, and those instructors were not human. According to the Book of Adam and Eve, Cain's first night in Nod was not spent alone. As darkness fell over the strange land where God's presence did not reach, Cain saw lights in the distance. Not the light of fire, for fire burns with a specific quality recognizable to human eyes. These lights moved differently, pulsed with colors that seemed almost alive. Drawn by curiosity, or perhaps compelled by the mark itself, Cain approached. What he found were beings the text describes as beautiful and terrible at the same time. They appeared somewhat human in form but taller, their features too perfect, their eyes containing depths that made Cain feel he was falling even while standing still. They spoke to him, though whether with actual voices or directly into his mind, the text remains ambiguous. And they made him an offer. These beings told Cain that his exile was not an ending but a beginning. They explained that he now stood in a place between worlds, a location where the rigid laws established by the Creator became flexible. Here, they said, Cain could learn things that angels knew, but humans were never meant to discover. They offered to teach him secrets of construction that could raise buildings touching the sky. They promised knowledge of metals hidden in the earth and how to shape them into tools and weapons of incredible power. They revealed methods of influencing the thoughts and emotions of others, bending weaker minds to his will. They showed him patterns in the stars that could predict futures and summon forces from beyond the visible world. All of this they offered freely, asking nothing in return except that Cain accept their instruction and pass what he learned to his children. But who were these beings? The Ethiopian texts identify them through several names. Sometimes they are called the Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, but who grew fascinated by what they saw. Other passages call them the sons of God, who looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, leading to the infamous unions that would produce the Nephilim giants. Still other sections describe them as rebels, angels who questioned the Creator's plan and sought to establish their own version of creation, one where they, rather than God, held ultimate authority. What matters for our story is that these beings saw in Cain an opportunity. He was marked, transformed, able to perceive them clearly. He was exiled, cut off from God's presence, desperate for purpose and community. He was the first murderer, already stained with blood, already familiar with transgression. He was perfect for their purposes. Cain accepted their offer. How could he not? He had lost everything. His family rejected him. God had cursed him. The ground would no longer yield crops for him. He wandered in a strange land where his old skills meant nothing. These beings offered him a new identity, new purpose, new power. They taught him, and he proved an eager student. Night after night, Cain learned. He learned to hear the language of stones and metals. He learned geometric patterns that could channel unseen energies. He learned names, secret names, names of angels and demons and forces that predated human creation. He learned to build not just with physical materials, but with intention and will, creating structures that were as much spiritual as physical. And as he learned, the city began to rise. The Book of Jubilees provides additional details that the Book of Genesis omits. It describes how Cain's city was constructed according to principles he could not have invented himself. The layout followed celestial patterns, with streets and buildings aligned to stars and planetary movements in ways that ancient astronomers would later recognize as impossibly advanced. The city's central structure was not a temple to God, for God's presence did not reach not, but rather a tower designed to connect earth with the lower heavens, the regions where the Watchers dwelt. Cain's city became a meeting place, a crossroads where humans and fallen angels could interact more freely than anywhere else in creation. It was, in essence, the first gateway, the first permanent portal between dimensions, and its existence would have consequences that would eventually force God to cleanse the entire earth with floodwaters. But before we reach the flood, we must understand what happened within Nod's walls. Cain took a wife, and the Bible never explains where she came from, a question that has troubled readers for generations. The Ethiopian texts suggest she was not entirely human, or perhaps was human, but from a line we know nothing about, or possibly was one of Adam and Eve's other daughters, though that raises its own uncomfortable questions. Regardless of her origin, Cain and his wife had children. Their first son was named Enoch, not to be confused with the righteous Enoch from Seth's line who walked with God and was taken to heaven. Cain's Enoch was different. He grew up in a city built on forbidden knowledge, surrounded by beings who should not have been there, learning secrets humans were never meant to know. And Cain named the city after this son, establishing a dynasty that would change the course of human history in ways the traditional Bible only hints at. The text records that something was different about Cain's descendants from the very beginning. They grew faster than normal children. They demonstrated abilities and understanding beyond their years. They possessed instinctive knowledge of arts and sciences that should have taken generations to develop. The mark that God had placed on Cain seemed to pass to his children, not as a visible sign, but as an inheritance of perception and capability. They could see what others could not see. They could hear what others could not hear. They could learn from teachers that existed in frequencies of reality close to ordinary humans. Generation by generation, Cain's family line became less like the humans that came from Adam through Seth, and more like something else. Something hybrid, something that walked the border between human and angel, between flesh and spirit, between the earth and the spaces in between. Like this video if you are starting to see how deep this mystery goes, because the next chapter reveals the names and achievements of Cain's descendants, and what they built will shock you. Chapter 3. The city built in shadows. The Genesis account lists Cain's descendants in rapid succession, as if eager to move past them to more righteous bloodlines. Cain fathered Enoch. Enoch fathered Irad. Irad fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Methujael. Mehujael fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives, Ada and Zillah, who bore children that the text specifically identifies as founders of entire vocations. Jubal became the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. Jubal became the father of those who play the harp and flute. Tubal-Cain became the forger of bronze and iron implements. And there was also a daughter named Naamah, whose role remains mysterious, but who later Jewish traditions connect to demons and forbidden knowledge. This brief genealogy, often skipped in Bible studies, actually contains earth-shaking implications that the Ethiopian texts make explicit. First, consider the timeline. According to biblical chronology, these developments happened within a relatively short span of generations. 7 generations from the first human to the establishment of music, metallurgy, animal husbandry, and tool-making as organized disciplines. That acceleration alone should raise questions. Archaeological evidence suggests these technologies developed over thousands of years through slow human trial and error, yet Cain's line accomplished it all within living memory of Eden itself. How? The traditional answer is that humans were simply more capable in those early days, that their proximity to creation meant greater intelligence and longer lifespans, allowing faster development. But the Ethiopian texts offer a different explanation, one that fits the pattern we have already begun to see. Cain's descendants did not invent these arts through normal human ingenuity. They were taught, just as Cain was taught, by beings who already possessed this knowledge from their time in the heavenly realms. Let us examine each achievement in detail, because the implications matter. Jubal is called the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. This might sound simple, almost primitive to modern ears, but it actually represents a complete restructuring of human lifestyle. Before Jubal, humans gathered what nature provided or cultivated small gardens as Adam had done. The domestication of animals required understanding breeding, behavior modification, disease management, and nutritional needs. The development of portable dwelling structures required knowledge of materials, weather patterns, and engineering principles that allowed shelters to be dismantled and reassembled without losing structural integrity. These were not simple achievements. They represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to the natural world, moving from living within nature's patterns to controlling and redirecting those patterns for human benefit. The Ethiopian Book of Jubilees specifically states that Jubal was instructed by watchers who had observed God's creative processes and understood how to manipulate animal behavior through methods that would today be called genetic selection and psychological conditioning. Then we come to Jubal, father of all who play the harp and flute. Music might seem like an innocent, even godly pursuit. David played the harp for King Saul. The Psalms are songs of worship. Surely music is a blessing from God, not connected to fallen knowledge. But the Ethiopian texts make a crucial distinction. There is music that praises the Creator and lifts the human spirit toward divine truth. And there is music that opens doors to other realms, that alters consciousness in ways that allow spirits to enter, that creates emotional and mental states vulnerable to manipulation by unseen forces. Jubal's music, according to these ancient sources, belonged to the second category. He was taught by watchers how to craft instruments whose tones resonated at frequencies that affected human neurological function. He learned melodies and rhythms that could induce trance states, lower critical thinking, and create group emotions that swept through crowds like fire through dry grass. His music was not for worship. It was for influence, for control, for creating the emotional atmosphere in which the watchers could move more freely among humans. The texts describe Jubal's performances in Nod's central plaza, where crowds would gather as night fell. As his fingers moved across the harp strings or breath moved through the flute, something would shift in the air. People would feel their hearts begin to beat in rhythm with the music. Their thoughts would quiet, their resistance would fade, and in that open, suggestible state, they would see things. Figures moving at the edges of vision, lights descending from the sky. Beings of beauty and power stepping through veils of reality that normally kept the physical and spiritual worlds separate. Jubal's music functioned as a kind of technology, a tool for thinning the barrier between dimensions. It allowed the watchers to appear more easily, to communicate more directly, to form relationships with humans that would have been impossible under normal conditions. This was not innocent artistic expression. It was, according to the Ethiopian sources, acoustic sorcery designed to facilitate forbidden contact between species God had intentionally separated. But perhaps most significant is Tubal Cain, whose very name would echo through later occult traditions as a symbol of forbidden craft. The text identifies him as the forger of bronze and iron, the first metalworker. Again, this might sound like simple technological progress. Humanity discovered metallurgy, civilizations advanced. What is the concern? But consider what metallurgy actually represents. It requires understanding that certain rocks are not simply rocks but contain metals that can be extracted through heat and chemical processes. It demands knowledge of temperatures far exceeding what natural fires produce, requiring furnace construction and fuel management. It needs comprehension of alloying, mixing different metals to create combinations stronger than either component alone. It involves techniques for shaping molten metal, for tempering and hardening, for creating tools and weapons that give their possessors overwhelming advantages over those without such technology. How did Tubal Cain learn all of this within a few generations of humanity's creation? The Book of Enoch provides the answer. Chapter 8 specifically names the watchers who taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, listing what each one revealed. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and body armor. He showed them metals and the art of working them. Semijazar taught enchantments and root-cutting, botanical knowledge with both medicinal and poisonous applications. Amaras taught the releasing of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs and constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, and Sariel taught the course of the moon. These were not humans gradually discovering natural principles through generations of experimentation. These were angels, beings who had participated in or witnessed God's creation of the physical world, deliberately teaching humans how to exploit creation's hidden mechanisms for power and control. Tubal Cain was Azazel's star pupil. Right, the texts describe him as obsessed, working day and night at his forges, while the watcher whispered secrets into his ears. He learned not just how to shape metal, but how to inscribe it with symbols and words that gave objects additional properties beyond their physical composition. A sword was not merely sharp steel, but could be made to carry curses that weakened enemies before a blow was struck. Armor could be engraved with signs that turned aside not just weapons, but certain spiritual attacks. Tools could be crafted that allowed their users to accomplish tasks that should have required strength or skill they did not possess. Tubal Cain was creating enchanted objects, artifacts that blurred the line between technology and magic, between human craft and spiritual power. His workshop in Nod became legendary, a place where the impossible became routine, where metal obeyed laws different from those governing the rest of creation. The Bible mentions one more of Lamech's children, a daughter named Naamah. Just one verse acknowledges her existence, providing no additional detail. Why mention her at all if she did nothing worth recording? The Ethiopian texts and later Jewish mystical traditions fill in what the Bible leaves silent. Nama was beautiful beyond measure, and her beauty was not natural. The mark of Cain had passed through the generations, but in her it manifested differently. While her brothers gained skill in practical arts, Nama gained mastery over something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous: human desire and will. She learned from female watchers, beings the texts sometimes call the daughters of twilight, how to use beauty as a weapon, how to speak words that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at emotional cores, how to create devotion and obsession in those who looked upon her, how to bind human wills to her purposes through techniques that were part psychology and part spiritual manipulation. Later traditions claim Nama became the mother of demons, that she mated with fallen angels and produced offspring even more twisted than the Nephilim. Whether literal or symbolic, the point stands: the women of Cain's line were as dangerous and as changed as the men. So within 7 generations, Cain's descendants had established a complete civilization built on forbidden knowledge. They had architecture that connected Earth to spiritual dimensions. They had music that opened human consciousness to manipulation by spirits. They had metallurgy that created objects of power beyond normal physical properties. They had mastery over animals and control over the emotional and psychological states of other humans. And all of it was taught by beings who had no right to share such secrets with mankind. Nor to become exactly what the Watchers intended: a laboratory where the boundaries God had established could be tested, pushed, and eventually broken. Comment below if you are beginning to understand why God would eventually send a flood to wipe this all away, because the corruption had only just begun. Chapter 4: Descendants of the Marked One. The genealogy of Cain presents a puzzle that most Bible readers never stop to consider. Genesis chapter 4 lists his descendants methodically: Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methushel, Lamech, and Lamech's children. Then the narrative abruptly shifts to Seth's genealogy in chapter 5, and we hear almost nothing more about Cain's line until the flood wipes them away. This silence has created space for centuries of speculation. Were Cain's descendants simply wicked humans who rejected God? Were they the same as any other ancient civilization that developed technology and culture? Or was something fundamentally different about them? Something that made them not quite human in the way Adam and Seth's line remained human? The Ethiopian texts answer this question clearly. Cain's descendants were hybrids, carrying both human and angelic genetics, possessing abilities that mark them as separate from the rest of humanity. And this hybrid nature was not accidental but intentional, part of a deliberate plan by the Watchers to create a race that would serve their purposes on Earth. We must understand what the Watchers were attempting to accomplish. These fallen angels had rebelled against God's established order, but they remained bound by certain limitations. They were spirits without physical bodies. They could appear to humans, could communicate, could even temporarily manifest in physical forms, but they could not permanently inhabit the physical world. They could not eat, reproduce, build lasting civilizations. They existed in the spaces between, powerful but insubstantial. Humanity, by contrast, was weak but physical. Humans could touch the earth, reshape it, reproduce and fill it with their kind. Humans had bodies that spirits coveted. The Watchers saw an opportunity. If they could combine their knowledge and power with human physicality, they could create something new, a race of beings with human bodies but angelic capabilities. Giants who could wield spiritual power while walking the earth. A hybrid species that could establish a kingdom that would rival or even replace God's intended order for creation. Cain was their opening. His mark made him perceivable to them and them to him. His exile placed him outside God's immediate protection. His guilt and desperation made him willing to accept instruction from any source that offered purpose. But the Watchers needed more than just one human student. They needed a breeding population, a genetic line they could manipulate over generations. So they did something the Bible hints at, but never fully explains. They took wives from among Cain's descendants. Genesis 6 famously states that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. Most biblical scholars connect this passage to the origin of the Nephilim giants. But the Ethiopian texts make clear that this was not the first time angels and humans had mixed. It had already been happening in Nod for generations. Cain's wife, wherever she came from, bore children, and those children attracted the attention of watchers, who formed unions with Cain's daughters and granddaughters, producing offspring who carried angelic genetics from the very beginning of Cain's family line. This explains so much that the traditional account leaves mysterious. It explains how Cain's descendants developed skills so rapidly, because they were not entirely human and possessed innate capabilities beyond normal human limits. It explains why the Bible specifically mentions that Lamech's children became the fathers of entire vocations, because they were establishing not just careers but bloodlines. Genetic strains carrying specific talents passed through hybrid inheritance. It explains the strange emphasis on Naamah, the only daughter mentioned by name in Cain's genealogy, because she represented the female side of hybrid development, carrying genetic material the Watchers wanted to preserve and spread. And that explains why God would eventually destroy the entire world with a flood, because the corruption was not merely moral or spiritual, but genetic. The human genome itself had been contaminated, mixed with angelic DNA in ways that threatened to make it impossible to bring forth the Messiah through a purely human bloodline. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim, the offspring of Watchers and human women, in terrifying detail. They were giants, standing 300 cubits tall according to some manuscripts, which would be over 450 feet, though other versions give more modest, but still enormous heights. They consumed vast quantities of food, eating more than normal humans could produce. When food ran out, they began consuming animals. When animals ran out, they began consuming humans. They were violent, oppressive, teaching mankind war and bloodshed. They possessed knowledge from their angelic fathers, secrets of sorcery and enchantments that allowed them to dominate normal humans completely. And they corrupted the earth, introducing genetic mixing not just among humans, but teaching humans to mix animal species in ways God never intended, creating hybrid creatures that violated the boundaries of creation itself. But here is what most treatments of this topic miss. The Nephilim described in Genesis 6 were not the first hybrids. They were simply the most famous, the most obvious, the ones whose size and violence made them impossible to ignore. The children and grandchildren of Cain, born in Nod from unions between humans and Watchers, were the prototype. They were first-generation hybrids, perhaps not as physically enormous as the later Nephilim, but carrying the genetic corruption nonetheless. They were the test cases, the experiments that taught the Watchers how human and angelic genetics could combine. And because they lived in Nod, a place outside God's immediate presence, they had time to reproduce and establish themselves before the corruption spread to the wider world. By the time Genesis 6 describes the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men, the Watchers had already perfected their technique in Nod. They knew what they were doing, and the rapid, overwhelming corruption that followed was the result of lessons learned in Cain's city. Ethiopian traditions preserved in various texts describe specific characteristics that marked the descendants of Cain as different from the descendants of Seth. They grew taller, though not always to giant proportions. Their eyes had unusual colors, sometimes described as golden or silver, or containing flecks of light that seemed to glow faintly in darkness. They learned skills with unnatural ease, as if remembering rather than discovering. They showed little fear of death or divine judgment, possessing a boldness that crossed into arrogance. They were beautiful, attracting others through physical appearance that exceeded normal human aesthetics, and they aged differently, living longer than they should have given the violence and excess of their lifestyles. These were not merely wicked humans. They were something else, something that shared human form, but carried within them the stamp of angelic corruption. The city of Enoch, named after Cain's son, became the capital of this hybrid civilization. The Book of Jubilees describes it as a wonder, with towers that reach toward the heavens, streets paved with stones engraved with symbols of power, buildings constructed according to geometric patterns that channeled unseen energies. At its center stood a great altar, but not an altar to God. This altar served as a focal point for rituals that called down Watchers from their places in the lower heavens. Blood was spilled there, and not just animal blood. The texts are disturbingly clear that human sacrifice was practiced in Nod, that Cain's descendants offered their own kind to the beings they served, buying favor and knowledge with the lives of slaves and captives. This was the first organized cult of demon worship, the template for all the dark religions that would follow throughout human history. The social structure of Nod reflected its hybrid nature. The descendants of Cain, who carried the most angelic genetics, formed an aristocracy, ruling over more fully human populations who had been absorbed into the city as servants, laborers, and breeding stock. These rulers did not govern through law or justice, but through raw power and spiritual intimidation. They could, according to the texts, perform acts that normal humans considered miracles, moving objects without touching them, knowing thoughts from a distance, appearing in multiple locations, causing pain or pleasure with a word. These were not divine gifts, but angelic abilities passed through hybrid genetics and taught by Watcher instructors. The population lived in fear and fascination, awed by their rulers' power while suffering under their cruelty. And all of it was justified by a philosophy that the Watchers had planted deliberately, that the strong had the right to rule the weak, that power justified itself, that God's laws were arbitrary restrictions meant to keep humanity small and controllable. This philosophy would echo through every tyrannical system that followed. Every empire that justified conquest through claims of superiority traced its spiritual roots back to the teachings first established in Nod. Every occult tradition that promised power to initiates who learned secret knowledge descended from the instruction Watchers gave to Cain's children. Every ideology that divided humanity into superior and inferior bloodlines carried DNA from the hybrid civilization built in the land east of Eden. Nod was the prototype for every system that would ever claim that some humans were more than human while others were less, that knowledge should be hoarded by elites, that the masses existed to serve the enlightened few. The curse of Cain was not just on one man or one family. It became a pattern, a spiritual code that replicated across cultures and centuries. Subscribe if you are starting to see this pattern in our own world, because the next chapter reveals how the Watchers chose Nod specifically for reasons that go beyond just Cain's presence there. Chapter 5. When Angels Fell to Earth. The Book of Enoch provides the most detailed account of the Watchers' descent and their corruption of humanity. Chapter 6 begins with a statement both simple and horrifying. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that, in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. What follows is a list of names, 200 Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon and swore an oath together to carry out their plan, binding themselves with mutual curses so that none could back out once the deed was done. This was not impulsive sin. It was conspiracy, planned and executed with full knowledge that they were violating the order of creation. But here is what most discussions of the Watchers miss. The descent described in Enoch chapter 6 was not the first interaction between these angels and humanity. The text itself provides clues. The Watchers are described as already having knowledge of where to find humans, already understanding human reproduction, already knowing human language and how to communicate their intentions. They did not descend blindly. They had been watching, which is what their name means. Watchers, observers, those appointed to keep guard over humanity. Somewhere in that watching, desire began to grow. Somewhere in that observation, rebellion took root. And somewhere, they began testing whether they could interact with humans in ways that God had not authorized. Nod provided the perfect testing ground. Cain arrived in Nod already marked, already perceiving realities that ordinary humans could not see. He was desperate, alone, cut off from family and from God. When the Watchers appeared to him, he had nothing to lose by listening. They taught him, they provided knowledge, and as Cain's family grew, the Watchers saw opportunity expanding. Here was a population already separated from God's immediate presence. Here were humans who had no established traditions about how to relate to angelic beings, no warnings from prophets or priests. Here was a place where they could experiment without interference from the divine presence that still hovered over Eden and the regions where Adam and Seth's families dwelt. Nod became their laboratory, and the descendants of Cain became their test subjects. By the time the 200 Watchers descended to Mount Hermon and made their infamous pact, they were not attempting something new. They were scaling up a program that had already proven successful in Nod. The Ethiopian texts describe how the Watchers first appeared to humans in Nod. They did not arrive in their full glory, for that would have overwhelmed mortal perception. Instead, they manifested in forms that humans could process, appearing as men of extraordinary beauty and presence. Their voices carried authority that made resistance feel impossible. Their eyes held depths that suggested vast knowledge and experience. They moved with grace that made human motion seem clumsy by comparison, and they offered what humanity has always found difficult to refuse: power, knowledge, pleasure, significance. They told Cain's descendants that they deserved more than the Creator had given them, that God was withholding secrets that would make humans equal to angels, that the restrictions placed on humanity were not for their protection but to keep them weak and subordinate, that by learning forbidden arts, humans could transcend their limitations and become like gods themselves. It was the same lie told to Eve in the garden, refined and expanded into a complete philosophical system. The names of the primary Watchers have been preserved, and understanding who they were and what they taught matters for our investigation. Semjaza was the leader, the one who first proposed the plan to take human wives and who organized the oath on Mount Hermon. Azazel was perhaps the most influential, teaching humans warfare, cosmetics, jewelry, and the metallurgy that Tubal-Cain would master. Gadriel taught humans how to make weapons of war and introduced the concept of killing in battle. Penumnu taught humans writing and gave them access to knowledge that was supposed to remain hidden, including secrets of wisdom that made humans question the Creator's authority. Casbiel taught abortion and other ways of controlling reproduction, disrupting the natural processes God had established. Barakel taught astrology, giving humans the impression they could predict and control their futures through understanding celestial patterns. Kokabel taught the interpretation of signs and portents. Ezekiel taught knowledge of clouds and weather manipulation. Arakel taught earth signs and geomancy. Shamsiel taught secrets of the sun's power. Sariel taught the lunar cycles and their influence on human consciousness. Each Watcher specialized in a particular domain of forbidden knowledge. Together, they gave humanity a complete education in how to manipulate natural forces, human psychology, spiritual realities, and the fabric of creation itself. But their teaching came with a price. Humans who learned from the Watchers did gain power and knowledge, but they also came under the Watchers' influence, bound to them through spiritual ties that functioned like addiction. The more knowledge a human received, the more they craved. The more they practiced the forbidden arts, the more they needed the Watchers' continued guidance. And the more they operated according to the Watchers' philosophy, the more they became like the Watchers themselves, proud, rebellious, convinced of their own superiority, willing to do anything to maintain and expand their power. The descendants of Cain were not just students. They were being transformed, remade in the image of their fallen instructors. The Book of Enoch describes what happened as this corruption spread. The Watchers did not merely teach and then withdraw. They lived among humans, forming communities where angels and humans mingled freely. They established temples and ritual sites where the boundaries between heaven and earth grew thin. They organized their human followers into hierarchies, creating secret societies bound by oaths similar to the oath the Watchers themselves had sworn on Mount Hermon. These societies preserved and transmitted the forbidden knowledge, ensuring it would not be lost even as individual humans died. They practiced rituals that called down more Watchers, that opened doorways to spiritual dimensions, that allowed demonic entities access to the physical world, and they bred with human women, producing the Nephilim, who would eventually terrorize the entire earth. But again, all of this began in Nod. The city of Enoch was the prototype for every secret society, every occult order, every mystery school that would follow. It was the first place where humans and fallen angels lived and worked together openly toward shared goals. What were those goals? The texts make clear that the Watchers were not simply satisfying lustful desires or seeking entertainment. They were attempting to corrupt creation at its foundation. God had established clear boundaries: angels in heaven, humans on earth, animals according to their kinds. The Watchers sought to blur and ultimately destroy these boundaries. They wanted to prove that God's order was not inevitable or necessary. They wanted to demonstrate that alternative forms of existence were possible. They wanted to create a reality where they, not God, made the rules, and humans were their tools, the raw material they would reshape to accomplish their purposes. Cain's descendants were the first experiment. The Nephilim were the second, and both experiments proved successful enough that God felt compelled to intervene directly through the flood. But even the flood did not completely eliminate what the Watchers had started. The Bible itself acknowledges that Nephilim appeared after the flood as well as before it, suggesting that somehow the hybrid genetics survived, perhaps through Noah's daughters-in-law or through some other mechanism the text does not fully explain. The knowledge the Watchers taught also survived, preserved in pre-flood texts that were hidden away, in oral traditions passed down through bloodlines, in artifacts and structures that carried encoded information. The Ethiopian Church claims to have preserved some of these ancient texts, books that were old when Moses was young, scriptures that the Western Church declared apocryphal and tried to suppress. And within these texts, the story of Nod and the Watchers remains central, a warning about what happens when humanity seeks power apart from God, and when angels rebel against their assigned place in creation. Comment below if you are beginning to understand why certain powers throughout history have tried to keep these texts hidden, because what comes next reveals exactly what the Watchers were building in Nod and why it terrified heaven itself. Chapter 6. The laboratory of rebellion. Nod was never meant to be just a city. It was a project, an experiment, a proving ground for ideas that would reshape reality if they succeeded. The Watchers who gathered there had a specific vision for what they wanted to accomplish. They were not content simply to teach humans or even to produce hybrid offspring. They wanted to create a complete alternative to God's creation, a second Genesis that would operate according to principles they designed. Nod was their laboratory, and everything that happened there was a test to see if creation itself could be hacked, rewritten, transformed into something that no longer required the Creator's presence or permission to exist. Understanding this helps us grasp why the Ethiopian texts describe Nod in language that sounds almost like science fiction, talking about dimensions, portals, altered states of consciousness, and the manipulation of fundamental forces. These were not primitive people using mythological language. These were hybrid beings with angelic knowledge attempting to do something that had never been done before. The central question driving the Watchers' experiments was this: could the separation between heaven and earth be permanently bridged? God had established a boundary. The physical world was distinct from the spiritual world. Humans lived in one realm, angels in another, and God beyond both. These realms could touch at points God designated, through visions, through angels sent as messengers, through the manifest presence of God appearing to prophets and patriarchs. But humans could not simply walk into the heavenly realms whenever they chose, and angels were not supposed to take up permanent residence on earth. The Watchers wanted to change this. They wanted to create locations where the two realms merged, where spirits could operate with physical power and where humans could access spiritual dimensions freely. Nod was their first attempt to build such a place. The architecture of Cain's city reflected this purpose. The Ethiopian texts describe buildings designed according to sacred geometry, patterns that existed in the heavenly realms and that the Watchers taught to Cain and his descendants. These were not arbitrary designs chosen for aesthetic reasons. The geometry functioned as technology, creating resonances and energy flows that affected the fabric of reality itself. Certain angles amplified specific spiritual frequencies. Certain proportions created harmonics between the physical structure and non-physical dimensions. Certain measurements established correspondences between Earth measurements and celestial distances, creating a kind of sympathetic magic where manipulating the earthly structure influenced heavenly realities. The buildings in Nod were, in essence, machines for altering consciousness and opening doorways between worlds. At the city's center stood the Great Tower, a structure the text compared to the later Tower of Babel, but describe as far more sophisticated. This tower was not built out of human pride alone, but according to explicit instructions from the Watchers. It rose in 7 tiers, each tier corresponding to one of the lower heavens. the regions where fallen angels dwelt after their expulsion from God's immediate presence. The top of the tower featured a platform where rituals were conducted at specific times, aligned with stellar and planetary movements. These rituals involved chanting names, drawing symbols, burning specific substances whose smoke carried intentions into higher dimensions, and offering sacrifices that included both animals and humans. The purpose was to create a permanent opening, a gateway that would allow watchers to descend and ascend freely without requiring the energy expenditure needed to cross dimensions through normal means. The tower was, in our terms, a portal device, a mechanism for punching a hole through the veil between realms and keeping it open. But the experiments in Nod went beyond architecture. The Watchers taught their human students techniques for altering consciousness in ways that allowed humans to perceive and interact with spiritual realities directly. These techniques included meditation practices that silenced the rational mind, allowing deeper layers of consciousness to emerge. They included the use of plants and substances that changed brain chemistry, producing visions and experiences of other dimensions. They included sexual practices that generated intense emotional and energetic states, creating openings for spiritual entities to enter human bodies. They included breathing exercises that affected the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, inducing trance states. They included exposure to specific sounds like Jubal's music that entrained brainwaves to frequencies where spiritual perception became easier. All of these techniques would later be found in various forms across human cultures, in shamanic traditions, mystery schools, tantric practices, or cult orders. But according to the Ethiopian sources, they all originated in Nod, taught by Watchers to willing human students. The genetic experiments were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Nod's function as laboratory. We have already discussed the Nephilim, the giants born from Watcher-human unions, but the texts hinted experiments that went beyond simple crossbreeding. The Book of Jasher, referenced in the Bible but no longer part of the canon, states that in the days before the flood, humans began mixing animals of different species, creating hybrids that violated God's created order, where each reproduced according to its own kind. Who taught humans how to do this? The Ethiopian texts attribute this knowledge to Azazel and other Watchers who understood the principles of life and reproduction from their time observing God's creative work. In Nod, protected from interference, they taught Cain's descendants how to crossbreed animals, how to manipulate the development of embryos, how to combine characteristics from different creatures. The results were monsters, aberrations that could not have existed through natural processes. And the same techniques were applied to humans, not just through Watcher-human unions, but through deliberate manipulation of human bloodlines to emphasize certain traits and create specialized sub-races. What were they trying to create? The text suggests the Watchers were attempting to produce a race of beings that combined the best features of angels and humans, while eliminating the weaknesses of both. Angels possessed knowledge, power, and longevity, but lacked physical bodies and could not directly reshape the material world. Humans possessed bodies and reproductive capacity, but were weak, short-lived, and ignorant. The ideal hybrid would have an angel's mind and a human body, combining spiritual power with physical presence. Such beings would be unstoppable. They could walk the earth with divine knowledge. They could reproduce and fill the world with their kind. They could build civilizations that operated according to principles drawn from heavenly wisdom. And they would owe their existence not to God, but to the Watchers, creating a race loyal to its creators and hostile to the Creator. This was the ultimate goal. The Nephilim giants were impressive but flawed, too violent, too dependent on consuming vast resources, too obvious in their abnormality. The subtler hybrids developing in Cain's line were the real success, carriers of corruption that could pass as human while slowly transforming humanity into something else. The spiritual technology developed in Nod also included methods for binding human souls to specific purposes even after death. The Ethiopian texts describe a belief among Cain's descendants that death was not the end, that their spirits could remain active in the world, attached to locations or objects, or even possessing living humans to continue their work. The Watchers taught them techniques for preparing consciousness to survive bodily death, for anchoring their awareness to physical items that would last beyond their lifetimes, for establishing spiritual dynasties where the dead guided the living toward shared goals. This was the origin of ancestor worship, of necromancy, of spirit contact and communication with the dead. And it was not superstition or primitive misunderstanding. It was technology, methods based on real understanding of how consciousness and spirit interact with physical reality. The monuments and structures in Nod were designed to house these spirits, to provide anchor points where the dead could maintain their presence and influence. The city was not just inhabited by the living, it was populated by the spirits of generations of Cain's descendants, creating an increasingly dense spiritual atmosphere where human and angelic presences mingled with the ghosts of the hybrid dead. The philosophy that developed in Nod justified all of these experiments through a simple premise: that God's restrictions were arbitrary and harmful, meant to keep humanity weak rather than to protect it from dangers it could not handle. The Watchers taught that the forbidden fruit in Eden had not been about disobedience but about awakening, that Eve had done humanity a service by seeking knowledge. They taught that Cain's murder of Abel was not sin but the first assertion of human will against divine determinism, that Cain had refused to accept a subordinate position and had claimed his right to shape his own destiny. They taught that God's curse on Cain was actually a gift, marking him as special and opening his perception to higher realities. They taught that the separation between heaven and earth was a prison, not a protection, and that humanity's destiny was to break down the walls and claim its birthful heritage as beings made in God's image. Every occult tradition that followed would echo these ideas. Every mystery school would promise initiates that they could become as gods. Every esoteric teaching would claim that enlightenment meant transcending the Creator's limiting rules. And all of it began in Nod, where the Watchers first formulated the philosophy of rebellion as liberation. Like this video, if you are starting to recognize these ideas in modern transhumanism, in movements that promise to transcend human limitations through technology, in philosophies that treat traditional morality as outdated restriction rather than protective wisdom, because the next chapter reveals what the Watchers' experiments produced, and the results were so horrifying that they provoked a response from heaven itself. Chapter 7. Giants among men. The Nephilim have captured human imagination for millennia. These giants, described in Genesis 6 and elaborated in the Book of Enoch, represent one of the Bible's strangest elements, a detail so unusual that many modern scholars try to explain it away as mythology or metaphor. But the Ethiopian Church never doubted the literal existence of these beings. The texts they preserved describe the Nephilim in visceral detail, and the descriptions paint a picture not of mythological creatures, but of abominations, beings whose very existence violated the structure of creation and whose presence threatened to make the earth uninhabitable for ordinary humans. Understanding the Nephilim and their connection to Nod is essential for grasping why God eventually decided that the entire world except for Noah's family had to be destroyed. These were not merely large humans. They were something that should never have existed, products of forbidden unions that blurred the boundaries between species in ways that made them fundamentally incompatible with God's created order. The Book of Enoch describes the birth of the first Nephilim with horror. When the Watchers took human wives and those women became pregnant, the pregnancies were not normal. The mothers experienced agony, their bodies struggling to accommodate fetuses that grew far beyond human size. Many women died in childbirth, their bodies literally torn apart by infants who emerged already larger than normal adults. Those who survived the birth were traumatized, describing their children as monsters, even as maternal instinct compelled them to nurse and care for them. The infants grew at impossible rates, reaching adult size within years rather than the decade and a half required for normal human development. And from the beginning, they were violent. They fought with each other, with their mothers, with any human who came near them. They seemed to possess awareness beyond their years, as if they inherited memories and knowledge from their angelic fathers, and they were hungry, constantly, insatiably hungry. According to Enoch, the Nephilim began by consuming everything humans produced. They would eat the entire harvest of a field in a single meal. They would slaughter herds of livestock and devour them raw. They demanded constant feeding, and their hunger could not be satisfied through normal agriculture or animal husbandry. As they exhausted the food supply, they turned to hunting, killing wild animals in numbers that threatened to exterminate entire species. And when animals became scarce, they began to view humans as food. The text is explicit: the Nephilim ate human flesh. They hunted humans as prey, killing and consuming them with no more conscience than humans feel when slaughtering cattle. This was not warfare or sacrifice, it was predation. The Nephilim viewed normal humans as inferior, as resources to be consumed, and there was nothing humans could do to stop them. The giants were too strong, too fast, too resilient. Weapons that would kill a human bounced off their flesh. Injuries that would cripple a man healed in days. They were apex predators, and humanity had become prey. But the physical threat was only part of the problem. The Nephilim carried spiritual corruption in their very genetics. They were hybrids, part human and part angelic, and their mixed nature meant they fit fully into neither realm. They could not enter the heavenly dimensions, for they had human bodies anchoring them to earth. But neither could they live as humans, for they carried angelic consciousness that gave them awareness of realities humans could not perceive. They existed in a state of spiritual torment, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace in either realm. And this torment expressed itself through violence, cruelty, and the relentless pursuit of pleasure and power as distractions from their inner anguish. The Nephilim were not merely dangerous. They were pitiable and terrifying at once, beings whose very existence was a kind of torture. The Ethiopian texts describe different categories of Nephilim, suggesting that not all were identical. Some were primarily giants, massive in size but relatively human in appearance and behavior. Others had physical deformities, extra limbs or digits, features that showed their mixed heritage more obviously. Some possessed abilities beyond mere strength. They could move objects with thought, could influence human minds from a distance, could see events happening far away or even glimpse possible futures. These abilities came from their angelic parentage, inherited spiritual capabilities operating through physical bodies. And some Nephilim, the texts suggest, were worse than others in their cruelty and corruption. Certain names are preserved as particularly wicked: Awaya and Haya, sons of the Watcher Semgaza, who led groups of giants in campaigns of conquest and destruction. Mahawe, another giant, who according to later texts attempted to intercede with Enoch on behalf of the Watchers, suggesting that at least some Nephilim recognized their predicament and sought escape from their cursed existence. The connection between the Nephilim and Nod becomes clear when we consider timing and geography. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers descending to Mount Hermon and scattering across the earth to take wives from among human women. But this mass descent happened after the pattern had already been established. Where did the Watchers first learn that unions with humans were possible? Where did they discover what the offspring of such unions would be like? The Ethiopian texts suggest the answer in Nod, where Watchers had been interacting with Cain's descendants for generations. The earliest hybrids were born in Nod, products of unions between Watchers and Cain's daughters. These first Nephilim were the prototypes, the experiments that taught the Watchers what worked and what did not. And when the 200 Watchers made their pact on Mount Hermon, they were not venturing into unknown territory. They were scaling up a program that had already proven its viability in Cain's city. They had been developing for generations, growing in number and power within Nod, while the rest of humanity remained largely ignorant of their existence. By the time the giants began to spread beyond Nod's borders and interact with Set's descendants, they were already an established species with their own culture and social structures. They saw themselves as superior to humans, as rightful rulers, as the next step in evolution or creation. They believed the earth belonged to them by right of power, and they had the strength to enforce that belief. When they finally emerged from Nod and began to conquer surrounding territories, humanity had no defense. Normal humans could not fight giants. They could only flee, submit, or be destroyed. The Bible preserves hints of this in later passages that describe giant clans living in Canaan when the Israelites entered the Promised Land. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Og king of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long, Goliath of Gath with his 6 cubits and a span height. These were remnants, survivors or descendants of the Nephilim who somehow made it through the flood. But in the days before the flood, the giants were far more numerous and more powerful. They ruled entire regions. They established kingdoms. They built monuments that would last millennia. Structures like Baalbek in Lebanon, with its massive foundation stones that weigh hundreds of tons and that modern engineers cannot explain. These were not primitive humans struggling with stone tools. These were giants with the knowledge of watchers, constructing temples and fortresses that demonstrated capabilities far beyond what the ancient world should have possessed. The spiritual implications of the Nephilim's existence were as catastrophic as their physical impact. Their presence proved that the boundaries of creation could be violated. They demonstrated that angelic and human could mix, that hybrids could be created and reproduced. This was a direct assault on the integrity of God's design. The Creator had established kinds, categories, species that were to remain distinct. The Nephilim represented the destruction of those distinctions, the blurring of categories in ways that threatened to make creation itself unstable. If angels and humans could produce offspring, what other boundaries could be crossed? Could humans and animals mix? The Book of Enoch suggests this happened. Could spiritual and physical laws be rewritten? The events in Nod suggested they could. The Nephilim were living proof that the Watchers' rebellion had achieved partial success. They had created something new, something God had not made, something that had no place in the original creation. And if this corruption continued unchecked, if hybrid genetics spread through the entire human population, then there would be no pure human line through which the promised Messiah could come. The entire plan of redemption would be threatened. This is why God looked at the earth and saw that the wickedness of man was great, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and that he regretted making mankind. This is why God decided to destroy every living thing on the earth except for Noah and his family. It was not merely that humans were sinful. Humans had been sinful since the fall in Eden. It was that humanity itself was in danger of being erased, genetically corrupted beyond recovery. The Nephilim were spreading. The knowledge of the Watchers was spreading. The philosophy that justified rebellion as enlightenment was spreading. And Nod was the source, the ground zero, the laboratory where it all began. Comment below your thoughts on whether remnants of Nephilim genetics still exist in modern human bloodlines, because the next chapter dives deep into the Ethiopian texts that Western Christianity tried to bury, and what they reveal will change how you read your Bible forever. Chapter 8. The Sons of Twilight. The Ethiopian Book of Adam and Eve contains passages that do not exist in the canonical Genesis account. These sections describe events after Cain's exile with a level of detail that raises immediate questions. Where did this information come from? Why was it preserved in Ethiopia but nowhere else? And why did Western church authorities reject these texts as apocryphal despite their obvious antiquity? The answers to these questions matter because the Book of Adam and Eve provides the most complete account of what happened to Cain in Nod, including specific descriptions of the beings he encountered and the instruction he received. These passages were not invented by later writers speculating about gaps in the biblical narrative. Ethiopian tradition holds that these texts descended from pre-flood sources, records kept by early patriarchs, and somehow preserved through the catastrophe that destroyed the ancient world. Whether or not we accept that claim, the content of these texts deserves examination because they provide context that makes sense of otherwise inexplicable elements in the Genesis account. The Book of Adam and Eve describes Cain's first night in Nod with vivid detail. After wandering for days, exhausted and despairing, Cain collapsed at the base of a strange rock formation. He fell into fitful sleep, tormented by dreams of his brother's face and the voice of Abel's blood crying out from the ground. But then the dream changed. Cain found himself standing in darkness, but it was not the natural darkness of night. It was a darkness that had texture and weight, that pressed against him, that seemed almost alive. And within that darkness, lights began to appear. Not the light of stars or fire, but lights that moved with intention, that circled him like predators studying prey. Cain tried to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. He tried to run, but his legs would not obey. He could only watch as the lights drew closer, closer, until they surrounded him completely, and then they spoke. The voices did not come through his ears, but directly into his mind, bypassing physical senses entirely. They were many voices and one voice at the same time, male and female, and neither, echoing with harmonics that no human throat could produce. They addressed him by name, Cain, son of Adam, marked by the Creator, exiled from the presence of God. They asked him questions. What did he want? What would he give to escape his punishment? Was he willing to learn things that other humans would never know? Cain, terrified and desperate, answered that he would do anything, learn anything, give anything, if only he could find purpose and escape the torment of isolation and regret. The voices seemed pleased. They told him that he had entered a land where the rules were different, where God's immediate authority did not reach, where they could teach him without interference. They said they had been waiting for someone like him, someone marked, someone capable of perceiving them clearly, someone with nothing left to lose. They told him to return to the rock formation when he woke and to perform a specific ritual. And then the dream ended. Cain woke at dawn, unsure whether he had truly dreamed or experienced something else. But the memory of the voices remained perfectly clear, unlike normal dreams that fade within minutes of waking, and he remembered their instructions in exact detail. He was to return to the rock formation as evening approached. He was to build a small altar from 7 stones. He was to cut his hand and let his blood drip onto the altar while speaking the names the voices had taught him. He was to sit in silence until the stars appeared and then wait for the voices to return. Cain hesitated, some part of him recognizing that he stood at another threshold, similar to the moment before he killed Abel. He could choose to obey these voices, or he could refuse and continue wandering without guidance or purpose. In the end, desperation won. That evening, Cain built the altar, cut his hand, spoke the names, and waited. As full darkness fell, they came. But this time, they did not appear as lights in a dream. They manifested physically, stepping out of the air itself as if passing through invisible doorways. The text describes them as human-like but wrong in subtle ways that made them disturbing to look at directly. They were too tall, too beautiful, their proportions just slightly off in ways that created a sense of unease. Their eyes reflected starlight, though no stars were visible yet. Their skin seemed to glow faintly with its own luminescence. They wore garments that looked like woven light, shimmering in shifting colors that hurt to watch for long. And when they moved, they did not quite touch the ground, hovering a finger's width above the earth. Cain knew immediately that these were not human, not animal, not anything that belonged to the world he knew. These were the sons of twilight, beings that existed in the borderland between day and night, between heaven and earth, between creation and rebellion. The beings spoke, and this time Cain heard them with his physical ears. They introduced themselves using names that the text records, but that scholars still debate how to pronounce: Gadriel, Penemwe, Kisbeel, and others. They explained that they were angels, created by God to serve and worship, assigned to watch over humanity and report back to heaven what they observed. But in watching, they had developed opinions. They had seen potential in humanity that God seemed reluctant to unlock. They had observed suffering that God allowed to continue. They had witnessed injustice and death and cruelty that God did nothing to prevent. And they had concluded that God's plan for creation was flawed, that humanity deserved better than what the Creator provided. They had begun to question, to doubt, to consider alternatives. And in considering, they had started to rebel. But they could not rebel alone. Angels were powerful but limited in what they could accomplish without physical presence in the material world. They needed allies, partners, students who could act on earth in ways that angels could not. Cain was perfect for their purposes. He was marked, exiled, already in rebellion against God's order. He had demonstrated willingness to violate divine law by killing his brother. He was desperate enough to listen and stubborn enough to persevere in difficult learning. The sons of twilight offered Cain a bargain. They would teach him everything they knew, secrets of creation and destruction, methods for building and influencing and controlling. They would give him power that would make him more than human. They would help him establish a city, a civilization, a legacy that would last beyond his lifetime. In return, Cain would do three things. First, he would obey their instruction without question. Second, he would pass what he learned to his children and ensure the knowledge was never lost. Third, he would prepare the way for more of their kind to enter the physical world, creating conditions where watchers could cross over more easily and interact with humans more freely. Cain, seeing no other path forward, agreed. What followed was an education unlike anything that had existed before. The sons of twilight taught Cain night after night, instruction that continued for what the text suggests was years. They taught him the names of stones and metals and plants, not the names Adam had given them, but their true names, the words that described their essential nature and that gave power over them when spoken correctly. They taught him geometric patterns that existed in heaven before creation, and that could be used to structure physical buildings in ways that channeled spiritual energies. They taught him astronomy, showing him how the stars and planets moved in cycles and how those cycles influenced events on Earth in predictable ways. They taught him rudimentary chemistry, how to extract essences from plants and minerals, how to combine substances to create medicines and poisons and compounds that altered consciousness. They taught him the structure of language and how words carried power, how speaking certain sounds in certain orders could affect reality. They taught him the anatomy of human consciousness, explaining how the soul connected to the body and where the points of vulnerability existed that allowed spiritual beings to influence human thought and emotion. They taught him ritual, methods for calling spirits, binding them, commanding them, sending them away. They taught him blood magic, the use of sacrificed life force to power spiritual workings. And they taught him sex magic, techniques for generating power through sexual energy, and using that power to achieve various ends, including the creation of hybrid offspring. Cain absorbed it all. The mark that God had placed on him seemed to enhance his ability to learn, opening his mind to concepts that would have been incomprehensible to ordinary humans. He began to practice what he learned, experimenting with rituals and constructions and manipulations, and he began to teach others. When his wife bore children, Cain trained them from infancy in the forbidden arts. When other humans wandered into Nod, refugees or exiles or simply curious travelers, Cain welcomed them and offered them knowledge in exchange for loyalty and obedience. Slowly, a community formed around him, and at the center of that community stood the school of the Sons of Twilight, a place where humans and angels mixed freely, where forbidden instruction was given openly, where the first mystery school in human history was established. Every secret society that followed, every occult order, every esoteric tradition that promised enlightenment to initiates who learned hidden knowledge, traced its spiritual genealogy back to those nights in Nod when Cain sat at the feet of fallen angels and learned things that God had never intended humans to know. The text describes one particular teaching that the Sons of Twilight emphasized repeatedly. They told Cain that the greatest secret, the knowledge that changed everything, was this: that humans were not meant to remain as God had made them, that humanity was unfinished, a work in progress, and that the next stage of human development required transcending the limitations the Creator had imposed. Death was not inevitable, but a curse that could be overcome. Weakness was not inherent, but a restriction that could be removed. Ignorance was not natural, but a deliberate suppression of potential that could be unlocked. Humans could become more, could become like gods, could become angels or even greater than angels if they were willing to do what was necessary. This required courage to defy divine law. It required willingness to experiment with forbidden techniques. It required sacrifice, sometimes of others, sometimes of one's own humanity. But the reward was transcendence, transformation, evolution into something higher and more powerful than mortal flesh. This was the lie wrapped around a truth. And this was the philosophy that would drive human sin and rebellion for all the generations that followed. Subscribe and share this with others who need to understand that the promises of modern transhumanism, genetic engineering, and technological enhancement are not new ideas, but ancient temptations repackaged for contemporary audiences. Chapter 9, East of Eden, Beyond Reality. Genesis 4:16 states simply that Cain went to dwell in the land of Nod, east of Eden. That single direction, east, carries more significance than most readers realize. Throughout Scripture, East becomes associated with exile and separation from God's presence. Adam and Eve are driven from Eden toward the east after their sin. The sun rises in the east, but humanity's fall happened in the east. When the Israelites are exiled from the Promised Land, they go east to Babylon. When Lot separates from Abraham and moves toward Sodom, he travels east. East represents the direction away from God, away from blessing, away from the source of life. But the Ethiopian texts suggest that Nod was not simply east geographically, it was east dimensionally, existing in a direction that had spiritual as well as physical significance. Nod was east of Eden, not just in miles but in metaphysical reality, located in a space that operated according to different rules than the rest of creation. The Hebrew word translated as Nod comes from a root meaning to wander or to shake or to move restlessly. Traditional interpretations connect this to Cain's curse that he would be a wanderer on the earth. But another interpretation suggests that Nod itself was a place of instability, where reality wavered and shifted, where the boundaries between physical and spiritual were in constant flux. Ethiopian texts describe Nod as a place where travelers could become lost in ways that defied normal geography, where distances seemed to change depending on intention, where certain areas could only be entered at specific times or by those with specific states of consciousness. This sounds like mythology until we compare it to descriptions from other cultures of thin places, locations where the veil between worlds grows transparent and strange things become possible. Every culture has such locations in its traditions: sacred mountains, ancient forests, desert wastes, islands shrouded in mist, places where the rules seem different, where time behaves oddly, where spirits move more freely. Nod was the first and the strongest of these thin places, deliberately chosen or perhaps even created by the Watchers as a location where they could interact with the physical world more easily than anywhere else. The Book of Jubilees provides geographical details about Nod that the Bible omits. It describes Nod as lying in a valley between two mountain ranges, a region where the sun reached at odd angles, creating unusual patterns of light and shadow. The vegetation was different from surrounding areas, with plants that grew in twisted shapes and colors not found elsewhere. Water sources in Nod had strange properties, sometimes causing visions or altered states in those who drank from them. The sky above Nod seemed darker even during daylight, as if a spiritual shadow lay over the land that physical sunlight could not completely penetrate. Animals avoided the region instinctively, and those that did wander into Nod often became aggressive or disoriented. It was not a dead place exactly, but it was a wrong place, somewhere that did not quite fit into the natural order of creation. And at the heart of this region, Cain built his city. The city's name is recorded in Genesis, Enoch, named after Cain's son. But the Ethiopian texts describe it in terms that make it clear this was no ordinary ancient settlement. The city was constructed as a mandala, a geometric pattern that had spiritual as well as practical significance. Treats radiated out from a central plaza in precise mathematical ratios. Buildings were placed according to calculations that aligned them with stellar positions. The city wall was not merely defensive, but served as a boundary marker separating the sacred space within from the profane world outside. Gates were positioned at specific points corresponding to cardinal directions and celestial events, opened and closed according to ritual timetables. The entire city functioned as a three-dimensional symbol, a sigil inscribed into the earth itself, designed to attract and channel spiritual energies. Walking through Enoch's streets was not simply moving from one place to another. It was following a path that affected consciousness, that gradually prepared visitors to perceive and interact with the spiritual presences that inhabited the city. At the city center stood the tower, the structure we have mentioned before. The Ethiopian texts describe it in detail that sounds almost technical. The foundation was laid on bedrock, in a location where underground water flowed in specific patterns that the Watchers identified as significant. The stones used in construction were selected for their composition and cut to precise measurements. Each stone was carved with symbols before being placed, inscribed with names and words of power that bound it into the structure, not just physically but spiritually. The mortar between stones contained substances beyond clay and water, minerals that had been consecrated through ritual, ashes of burned offerings, even blood mixed into the compound. As the tower rose, each level was dedicated through ceremonies conducted by Cain himself, rituals that called upon the sons of twilight to inhabit and empower the structure. The finished tower was not merely a building. It was a machine, an engine for punching through dimensional barriers, creating a permanent opening between earth and the lower heavens where the Watchers dwelt. The text describes what happened when the tower was completed and the final dedication ritual performed. As Cain and his followers chanted the names they had been taught, as smoke from burning sacrifices rose toward the sky, as blood was poured over the altar at the tower's summit, the air itself seemed to tear. Those present described seeing the sky split open, not in a physical sense, but in a way that revealed layers of reality normally hidden from human perception. They saw beings descending, not falling as if from height, but emerging as if stepping through a doorway, passing from somewhere else into the physical world at the location the tower marked. These beings were Watchers in greater numbers than Cain had previously encountered. Angels who had been waiting for a stable access point through which they could enter the material realm, and with their arrival, Nod changed. The city became a hybrid space, a place where angels and humans lived and worked together openly, where the division between heaven and earth broke down almost completely. Life in Enoch after the tower's completion was like nothing that had existed before or would exist again until perhaps the very end times. Humans who lived there could see spirits as clearly as they saw each other. Angels manifested in physical form, walking the streets, entering homes, participating in daily life. The knowledge that flowed through the city was overwhelming, as Watchers taught anyone willing to learn the secrets of creation, destruction, manipulation, and power. But this apparent enlightenment came with a terrible price. The humans who dwelt in Enoch began to lose their humanity, not physically at first, but spiritually. They grew cold, calculating, viewing other humans who had not received the same instruction as inferior, almost as a different species. They developed abilities that set them apart. Some could move objects without touching them. Others could see events happening at great distances. Still others could enter the dreams of people outside the city and plant suggestions that would influence waking behavior. They were becoming something other than human, transitioning toward a hybrid state where they were neither fully mortal nor fully spiritual, but trapped in between. And the city itself seemed to develop a kind of awareness. Those who lived there described feeling, watched even when alone, as if the stones themselves had eyes. They reported hearing voices in empty rooms, whispers that might have been the wind or might have been something else. They experienced dreams that were too vivid, too consistent, dreams that multiple people shared and that sometimes came true. They noticed that time felt different inside the city walls, that hours could pass like minutes or minutes stretch like hours depending on location and activity. Enoch was becoming alive, in the way that a haunted place is alive, saturated with spiritual presence, to the point where the physical and non-physical had merged into something new. It was, in essence, a successful experiment in creating a space where the kingdoms of earth and fallen heaven overlapped, where a new kind of reality was being born. And if the experiment had been allowed to continue, if it had spread to other locations, if the Watchers had succeeded in establishing multiple such cities across the earth, then God's original creation would have been overwritten, replaced by something that the fallen angels had designed. This is why the judgment had to come. This is why the flood had to cleanse not just wicked humans, but the very ground that had been corrupted by Nod's existence. Like this video if you are beginning to see parallels to modern smart cities, transhumanist compounds, and technological zones where the rules seem to be different than in normal society. Because what comes next explores how two competing bloodlines represented two completely different visions for humanity's future. Chapter 10. Architecture of the Fallen. The buildings constructed in Nod represented more than human ingenuity or even angelic instruction in practical arts. They embodied a complete cosmology, a worldview fundamentally different from the creation narrative God had established. When God created, He spoke and things came into being from nothing, ordered according to His will and purpose. The architecture of Nod operated on a different principle, that matter was fundamentally spiritual, that physical structures could serve as condensers and amplifiers of non-physical energies. The buildings were not shelters but tools for manipulating reality at its deepest levels. This understanding, taught by the Watchers to Cain's descendants, would influence human architecture throughout history wherever occult traditions gained influence. Temples, pyramids, monuments, and megalithic sites across the world bear traces of design principles that originated in that first cursed city. Understanding Nod's architecture helps us recognize its fingerprints in unexpected places. The foundation of this architectural philosophy was the concept of correspondence, the idea that patterns on Earth could mirror patterns in heaven, and that creating the earthly version would draw down the heavenly reality. The Watchers taught that the universe was organized according to specific geometric ratios and numerical relationships. These patterns existed before physical creation as divine thoughts, templates in the mind of God that shaped how reality would be structured. By discovering these patterns and replicating them in physical form, humans could tap into the power that created the universe itself. This was not just symbolic. The Watchers claimed that buildings constructed according to sacred geometry would literally function differently than structures built without this knowledge. They would be more stable, more durable, more resistant to decay. They would affect the consciousness of those who entered them, inducing specific mental and emotional states. And they would serve as anchors for spiritual presences, providing spaces where angels or other beings could manifest more easily. The texts describe specific patterns that the Watchers emphasized. The circle represented heaven, eternity, perfection, the infinite nature of spiritual reality. The square represented earth, limitation, the four-cornered physical world. Combining circle and square in structures created a meeting point between heaven and earth, between eternal and temporal. The triangle represented the divine principle, pointing upward toward higher realities, containing within its three sides the mystery of unity and multiplicity. The spiral represented ascension, the path from physical to spiritual reality winding upward in stages of initiation and transformation. The labyrinth represented the difficult journey toward enlightenment, with many dead ends and necessary backtracking before reaching the center. Each pattern carried meaning and power, and Cain's architects used them deliberately in the city's layout and in individual buildings. The materials used in construction also mattered. The Watchers taught that different stones carried different spiritual properties. Certain types of rock had been shaped by fire in the earth's depths and therefore resonated with transformative energies. Others had been formed under pressure and carried qualities of endurance and strength. Still others contained crystals or unusual mineral compositions that made them conductors of spiritual currents. Cain's descendants learned to identify these properties, to select stones not just for size and workability, but for their metaphysical characteristics. They learned which combinations of materials would amplify desired effects and which would cancel each other out. They developed the complete science of sacred architecture that treated buildings as living systems, organisms assembled from components chosen and arranged to achieve specific spiritual results. The most important structures in Enoch were built according to these principles, with extreme precision. The tower, of course, was the primary example, but there were others. A great hall where assemblies gathered, constructed so that sound behaved strangely within it, where a whisper at one end could be heard clearly at the other, but normal conversation in between became inaudible. A library built to preserve the knowledge the Watchers had shared, with rooms arranged in patterns that the initiated had to learn to navigate, creating a physical test of worthiness before access to deeper knowledge was granted. A temple where sacrifices were offered, designed so that the smoke from the altar would rise through a series of chambers, each chamber purifying and transforming the offering before it reached the opening at the top, where the spiritual recipients waited. A bathhouse where ritual cleansing took place, with pools arranged to correspond to planetary spheres, allowing bathers to progress through stages of purification aligned with cosmic order. Each building was a tool, a machine for accomplishing specific spiritual purposes. But perhaps most disturbing were the residential structures, the homes where Cain's descendants lived. These too were designed according to principles the Watchers taught, creating environments that gradually shaped the inhabitants. Doorways were positioned to face specific directions, controlling which spiritual influences would find easy access to the home. Windows were placed to allow light at certain times while blocking it at others, creating patterns of illumination that affected circadian rhythms and consciousness. Rooms were proportioned according to ratios that induced specific psychological states. meditation chambers that calmed the mind, study rooms that enhanced focus, sleeping quarters that deepened trance and made dreamers more susceptible to spirit contact. Even furniture and household objects were crafted with intention, creating complete environments that molded human consciousness toward openness to spiritual manipulation. The Ethiopian texts describe the experience of outsiders who visited Enoch and felt immediately that something was wrong. The city looked impressive, with buildings of a grandeur and sophistication that far exceeded what should have been possible given humanity's recent creation. But it felt oppressive. The air seemed heavy. Shadows fell in strange ways that made it difficult to judge distances or directions. Sounds echoed oddly, making it hard to determine where they originated. Visitors reported feeling watched, feeling that the city itself was somehow aware of their presence and not entirely welcoming. Those who stayed longer began to have vivid dreams that felt intrusive, as if someone or something was examining their thoughts while they slept. They experienced emotional swings, sudden desires or fears that did not feel like their own reactions. And they noticed that the longer they remained, the harder it became to imagine leaving, as if the city exerted a subtle gravitational pull on consciousness itself. This was by design. Enoch was built not just to house a population, but to transform that population, to gradually shift their consciousness away from human norms and towards something else. The Watchers had created an architectural system that functioned as a kind of spiritual technology, using physical structures to reshape human awareness. Every building, every street, every public space was calibrated to influence those who occupied it, pushing them toward greater receptivity to angelic instruction and greater willingness to participate in the forbidden experiments taking place within the city walls. Modern comparisons might include subliminal advertising, psychological manipulation through environmental design, or the way casinos are built to keep gamblers disoriented and engaged. But Nod's architecture was more sophisticated and more invasive, operating on levels that included but went beyond psychology to directly influence spiritual states. The ultimate goal was to create a population that was no longer fully human in consciousness, even if their bodies remained biologically human. People who thought like angels, who perceived reality the way Watchers did, who shared the fallen angels' perspective on God and creation and rebellion. Once that transformation was complete, these hybrid consciousness humans would naturally align with the Watchers' plans. They would produce children with beings from other dimensions. They would spread the knowledge and philosophy to other human populations. They would build more cities according to the same principles, creating a network of spaces where heaven and earth had merged incorrectly. And eventually, the Watchers believed they would have created enough momentum that God himself would be unable to reverse what they had started. The architecture was not an end in itself. It was a tool in a larger plan to remake creation according to a pattern that placed the Watchers, not God, at the center of authority. This architectural knowledge did not die with the flood. The texts suggest that information was preserved, hidden in artifacts, and encoded in structures that survived the waters, recovered by post-flood civilizations and adapted to their own purposes. When we read about Solomon's temple built according to precise divine specifications, we are seeing the same understanding of sacred architecture used correctly to create a space that draws humans toward God rather than toward fallen angels. When we see Egyptian pyramids aligned to stellar coordinates, Stonehenge positioned to mark celestial events, Aztec temples oriented to planetary movements, we are seeing knowledge that ultimately derived from the Watcher's instruction in Nod, passed down and distorted through generations but retaining core principles. And when we notice modern architects designing government buildings with occult geometric patterns, corporate headquarters incorporating esoteric symbolism, or entertainment complexes creating immersive environments designed to alter consciousness, we are seeing the same techniques applied with new technologies but toward the same ends, influencing human awareness and behavior through physical space in ways that bypass conscious resistance. Comment below if you have noticed architectural features in your own city that create unusual psychological effects, because what comes next reveals the bloodline that stood against everything Nod represented. Chapter 11. Two Paths, Two Destinies. While Cain's descendants built their civilization in Nod, another genealogy developed in the regions closer to Eden. Genesis chapter 5 provides the lineage from Adam through Seth, the third son born after Abel's murder. This genealogy is often skipped in Bible readings because it seemed like a dry list of names and ages, but comparing Seth's line to Cain's line reveals something crucial. These were not merely two family branches, but two completely different trajectories for humanity, two paths that led to opposite destinations. The Ethiopian texts make this division explicit, describing Seth's descendants as the keepers of righteousness, humans who remained faithful to God's original design and who resisted the corruption spreading from Nod. Understanding this division helps us grasp what was at stake in the days before the flood and why the mixing of these two bloodlines provoked such catastrophic divine response. Seth was born to replace Abel, whom Cain had murdered. Genesis 4025 records Eve's words at his birth. God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. The name Seth means appointed or granted, carrying the sense that this child was a divine provision, a fresh start after the tragedy that had befallen the first family. Seth's birth represented a choice, a moment when humanity could have turned entirely toward the path Cain had taken, or could have maintained connection to God's original purposes. Adam and Eve chose to invest hope in Seth, to teach him what they knew of God and Eden and the life they had lost through their own disobedience. And Seth, unlike his older brother Cain, proved faithful to that instruction. He did not seek forbidden knowledge. He did not rage against his limitations. He did not try to build a kingdom apart from God. Instead, he lived quietly, tended the earth as Adam had been intended to do, and raised children whom he taught to call upon the name of the Lord. The text tells us that in the days of Enoch, Seth's son, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. This simple statement has been interpreted in various ways, but Ethiopian traditions see it as the establishment of formal worship, the beginning of a distinct community that organized its life around devotion to God. While Cain's line built a city and developed technologies and created a sophisticated civilization, Seth's descendants remained pastoral and agricultural, living in tents and temporary settlements, gathering regularly to worship, keeping their lives simple and their focus on the divine relationship that Cain had abandoned. This was not primitive ignorance. It was intentional resistance to the temptations that had corrupted their relatives. Seth's family knew what was happening in Nod. Word traveled. Stories spread of the wonders being built there, of the knowledge being taught, of the powers being displayed. And Seth's descendants made a conscious decision to reject all of it. The Ethiopian Book of Jubilees describes the spiritual disciplines that Seth's line practiced to maintain their separation from Cain's corruption. They fasted regularly, denying physical appetites to strengthen spiritual focus. They maintained ritual purity, avoiding certain foods and practices that would have connected them to the spiritual forces active in Nod. They memorized and recited the stories of creation and fall, keeping alive the true account of origins in opposition to the distorted version that the Watchers were teaching. They practiced hospitality and care for the weak, creating communities based on mutual support rather than power hierarchy. And they sought direct relationship with God through prayer and meditation, not through rituals designed to summon and manipulate spiritual beings, but through humble requests for guidance and intervention from the Creator himself. This was worship as God intended, the life Adam and Eve were meant to live before the fall disrupted everything. The genealogy of Seth reads very differently from Cain's line, where Cain's descendants are associated with specific inventions and vocations. Seth's descendants are known for righteousness and unusual longevity. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enos lived 905 years. Canaan lived 907 years. Canaan lived 907 years. Mahalalel lived 862 years. Enoch walked with God and was taken at 365 years without dying. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest lifespan recorded in Scripture. Lamech lived 777 years. And Noah, who would eventually save humanity from the flood, was 600 years old when the waters came. These extraordinary ages have puzzled readers for centuries. Were they literal or symbolic? If literal, what allowed pre-flood humans to live so long? The Ethiopian texts suggest that longevity was connected to spiritual purity, that humans who maintained right relationship with God and who avoided the corruption spreading from Nod lived far longer than they would have otherwise. The Nephilim and Cain's hybrid descendants, despite their power, actually lived shorter lives than Seth's line, as if the mixed genetics created instability that accelerated aging and death. But one name in Seth's genealogy stands out above all others: Enoch. Not Cain's son who had a city named after him, but the seventh from Adam, a man described with a phrase used nowhere else in the Genesis narrative. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This cryptic statement has generated speculation for millennia. What does it mean to walk with God? Where did God take Enoch? And why is the Book of Enoch, which claims to record his visions and teachings, considered apocryphal by Western Christianity, but canonical by the Ethiopian Church? The answers matter because Enoch represents the clearest example of what humanity was supposed to become, not through forbidden knowledge and rebellion, but through faithfulness and relationship with the Creator. Enoch's life and departure demonstrated that transcendence was possible through the path God ordained, not only through the Watcher's counterfeit offer. The Book of Enoch, attributed to this patriarch, describes his experiences in detail. Enoch did not seek out Watchers or forbidden knowledge. Instead, God revealed to him the secrets of heaven and earth through legitimate means, showing him the structure of creation, the paths of angels, the mechanisms of judgment, and the future of humanity. Enoch saw the places prepared for the righteous and the wicked. He witnessed the Watchers' rebellion and heard their judgment pronounced. He was shown the coming flood and the reasons for it, and he was given understanding of how creation worked, knowledge that paralleled what the Watchers were teaching, but that came from the pure source rather than from rebellious intermediaries. Enoch proved that humans did not need to learn from fallen angels to gain wisdom. They could receive instruction directly from God if they maintained the relationship God offered. The contrast between the two Enochs is deliberate and instructive. Cain's Enoch had a city built in his honor, a monument to human achievement apart from God, a center of forbidden knowledge and hybrid corruption. Seth's Enoch built nothing that lasted on earth, but he walked so closely with God that he was taken bodily into heaven without experiencing death, becoming a monument to what faithful relationship could accomplish. One Enoch represented humanity's attempt to reach heaven through its own efforts, using knowledge stolen from angels. The other represented God reaching down to bring a faithful servant into heaven as a gift. One Enoch's city would be destroyed in the flood. The other Enoch's testimony would survive to warn and instruct future generations. The two Enochs embodied two completely different answers to the question of humanity's purpose and destiny. The texts describe increasing tension between the two bloodlines as generations passed. Seth's descendants looked at Cain's line with a mixture of horror and fascination. They saw the wonders being accomplished in Nod, the buildings and technologies and abilities that far exceeded anything Seth's simple agricultural communities possessed. They heard stories of giants, of angels walking as men, of knowledge that promised power beyond imagining. And some among Seth's line began to wonder if they had chosen wrongly. Perhaps God's way was too restrictive. Perhaps the Watchers were right that humans deserved access to knowledge that the Creator had hoarded. Perhaps faithfulness was just another word for weakness, and obedience another word for cowardice. This internal questioning would eventually lead to the catastrophe that made the flood necessary. But before that happened, there was a period when the two bloodlines remained separate, when it was still possible to choose which path to follow. And that choice was the most important decision any human could make, determining not just how they would live, but what they would become. Subscribe now, because the next chapter describes what happened when the barriers between these two bloodlines finally broke down, and purity mixed with corruption in ways that threatened to erase humanity entirely. Chapter 12: The Mountain and the Valley. The Ethiopian texts describe the geographical separation between Seth's descendants and Cain's line in terms that emphasize spiritual as well as physical distance. After Adam's death, Seth's family moved away from the regions close to Eden and established their primary settlements on a mountain that the Book of Jubilees calls the Mountain of the East, or sometimes the Holy Mountain. This mountain was high and difficult to access, with steep slopes and limited resources, requiring hard work to sustain life there. But it had one critical advantage: it was far from Nod and the contamination spreading from Cain's city. The elevation also carried symbolic weight. Seth's descendants lived above the valleys where most of humanity settled, physically closer to heaven, breathing thinner air that required stronger constitutions, isolated from the corruption below. The mountain became sacred to them, not because the rocks or trees possessed any divine quality, but because they had consecrated this place through their choice to live in separated devotion to God. Life on the mountain was hard. Resources were limited, requiring careful management and cooperation. The community remained small, with population growth constrained by the mountain's carrying capacity. They had none of the sophisticated technologies developing in Nod, no advanced metallurgy or architectural wonders. They lived simply, in tents and temporary shelters made from available materials, following herds and managing small gardens wherever the rocky soil permitted. They had no written texts yet, so all knowledge was memorized and transmitted orally from generation to generation. Elders taught children the stories of creation, of the fall, of Cain's rebellion. They taught the names of their ancestors and the ages each had lived. They taught the proper ways to worship, to offer sacrifice, to pray. And they taught the most important lesson: to maintain separation from Cain's descendants no matter what wonders or promises came from the valleys below. For generations this separation held. Seth's line maintained their mountain refuge, and Cain's descendants remained in Nod and the surrounding lowlands, building their hybrid civilization with its forbidden knowledge and angelic instructors. But as both populations grew, encounters became inevitable. Traders from the valleys would occasionally ascend the mountain, bringing goods to exchange and stories to tell. They spoke of marvels, buildings that touched the sky, music that could alter consciousness, weapons that cut through stone, knowledge that promised power over nature itself. They described the prosperity of Nod, where food was abundant and labor was assisted by technologies unknown on the mountain. They mentioned the Watchers, beautiful beings of light and power, who walked among men and shared the secrets of heaven. And they extended invitations: come down, see for yourselves, learn what we have learned. Join us in building a new world. The elders of Seth's line resisted these invitations, recognizing the spiritual danger. But among the younger generations, curiosity grew. They looked at their own difficult lives, the constant struggle to survive on the harsh mountain, the limitations of their knowledge and capabilities. They looked down into the valleys and saw lights at night, heard music on the wind, smelled smoke from fires larger than anything their communities could manage. They wondered what harm there could be in visiting, in seeing what Cain's descendants had built, in perhaps learning some useful techniques that could ease their own burdens. The young men especially felt the pull, their desire for adventure and significance making the mountain feel like a prison rather than a refuge. And the young women heard stories of beauty and luxury in the valley cities, of ease and pleasure and admiration that their hard mountain life could never provide. The temptation grew year by year, generation by generation. The Book of Jubilees describes the crisis that eventually broke the separation. A man from Seth's line named Jared, father of Enoch, had instituted strict prohibitions against descending from the mountain or interacting with the valley dwellers. He understood that the primary defense against corruption was simple avoidance, maintaining distance from temptation rather than trying to resist it through proximity. But after Jared's death, discipline began to erode. His son Enoch maintained the standards, but Enoch was taken by God at a relatively young age, leaving his son Methuselah to lead the community. Methuselah was righteous and long-lived, but as centuries passed and he aged, his authority weakened. Younger generations who had never known the founding patriarchs questioned the old restrictions. They saw no evidence of the dangers their elders warned about. The valley dwellers who visited seemed prosperous and happy. The Watchers from a distance appeared benevolent and helpful. Why should Seth's descendants live in poverty and isolation when abundance and knowledge were available below? The final breaking point came during a great festival in the valleys. The texts describe how word reached the mountain of a celebration planned in one of the valley cities, a gathering where people from across the region would come together for days of music, feasting, and demonstration of wonders. Messengers climbed the mountain specifically to invite Seth's descendants, promising that they would be honored guests, that they could witness all the marvels of the new civilization, and then return to their mountain if they chose. The invitation divided the community. The old guard insisted that attending would be spiritual suicide, that the festival was a trap designed to draw them into corruption. But the younger factions argued that isolating themselves forever was impossible, that eventually they would need to engage with the rest of humanity, that they could maintain their faithfulness while learning from others. The debate raged for days until finally a compromise was reached. A delegation would descend to the festival, observe what was happening, and return to report. They would not participate in anything spiritually compromising. They would not intermarry with valley dwellers. They would simply look and learn and come back. It was the beginning of the end. The delegation descended from the holy mountain, and though some returned as planned, many did not. Those who returned brought stories that made the valley civilization sound even more attractive than the warnings had suggested. They had seen buildings whose designs surpassed imagination. They had heard music that moved the soul in ways worship songs never had. They had met people whose knowledge and abilities seemed godlike compared to the simple shepherds of the mountain. They had even glimpsed the Watchers from a distance, beings of such beauty and majesty that the delegation could understand why some might mistake them for gods. And most tempting of all, they had met women from the valley cities, women whose beauty exceeded any on the mountain, who dressed in fine clothing and jewelry, who moved with confidence and spoke with wisdom, learned from their hybrid teachers. The young men of Seth's line could not stop thinking about these women, and soon, despite all warnings, more men began descending from the mountain, no longer just to observe, but to pursue relationships with the daughters of Cain's line. This is the context for Genesis 6:12-2. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Most interpretations focus on the phrase sons of God and debate whether it refers to angels or to Seth's descendants, but the Ethiopian texts make clear that both interpretations are correct. The passage describes a double corruption: Watchers taking human wives and producing Nephilim giants, and simultaneously, the sons of Seth abandoning their separated status to marry into Cain's corrupted bloodline. The result was the same in both cases: the mixing of pure and impure, the contamination of righteous genetics with hybrid corruption. And once that mixing began, it accelerated rapidly until the text tells us that God looked at the earth and saw that every inclination of human hearts was only evil continually. The separation that had protected a remnant of pure humanity collapsed, and with it collapsed any hope that mankind could recover without divine intervention. The tragedy was not merely that Seth's descendants became wicked. It was that they became indistinguishable from Cain's line, adopting the same philosophies, pursuing the same forbidden knowledge, producing children who carried the same spiritual and possibly genetic corruption. The mountain communities emptied as families moved to the valleys seeking easier lives. The worship practices that had defined Seth's line were abandoned or blended with the rituals practiced in Nod. The oral traditions began to incorporate stories and ideas from the Watchers' teaching, distorting the true account of creation. Within a few generations, there was no longer a clear distinction between the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain. All had become corrupted. All had mixed with the hybrid bloodlines. All had accepted some version of the lie that humans could transcend their limitations through forbidden knowledge and rebellion against divine order, and all faced the same judgment that was about to fall. Comment below if you recognize this pattern in modern calls for unity that require abandoning moral distinctions, because what comes next explains why only one family escaped the coming catastrophe. Chapter 13, When Purity Met Corruption. The intermarriage between Seth's descendants and Cain's line was not a gradual cultural exchange or a peaceful blending of two peoples. It was a catastrophe, a contamination event that threatened to make genuine humanity extinct. The Ethiopian texts describe this mixing in language that emphasizes its spiritual violence. When the sons of Seth married daughters from the valley cities, they were not simply choosing wives from a different tribe. They were joining themselves to women who carried hybrid genetics, who had been educated in forbidden knowledge, who worshipped through rituals designed to summon fallen angels, who bore children to watcher fathers as often as to human husbands. These marriages transferred corruption from one bloodline to another, ensuring that the children born to Seth's sons would carry the taint that God had intended the mountain separation to prevent. The texts describe the process of corruption in stages. First came fascination. The young men from Seth's line were overwhelmed by the sophistication of valley culture. Everything was more advanced, more beautiful, more exciting than the austere life they had known on the mountain. The women especially captivated them, not just through physical beauty, but through confidence and knowledge that mountain women lacked. These valley women could speak on subjects the men had never considered. They knew arts and sciences. They could discuss philosophy and theology, though from perspectives that subtly undermined divine authority. They demonstrated abilities that seemed miraculous. Some could predict weather changes, others could heal certain injuries. Still others could influence emotions through music or perfumes or simply through their presence. The men of Seth's line, accustomed to simple agricultural life, found themselves intellectually and emotionally outmatched, drawn into relationships where they were students rather than authorities, subtly dominated by women who represented a more advanced civilization. Second came compromise. To marry these women and integrate into valley society, Seth's descendants had to abandon practices that marked them as separate. They could not maintain the dietary restrictions that had helped preserve their community's identity. They could not observe the worship patterns that had structured mountain life around devotion to God. They could not refuse to participate in the festivals and rituals that were central to valley culture. They found themselves making small accommodations, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, but together representing a complete surrender of the distinctive faithfulness that had defined their bloodline. They told themselves they could maintain their core beliefs while adapting externally. But beliefs divorced from practice gradually erode, and within a generation, most of Seth's descendants living in the valleys had adopted the valley worldview completely. Third came education. The valley wives wanted to help their mountain husbands succeed in this more complex civilization. They taught them the knowledge that watchers had shared, not presenting it as forbidden, but as simply advanced understanding that ignorance and isolation had kept from the mountain communities. They taught geometry and astronomy, metallurgy and architecture, music and ritual, and with the technical knowledge came philosophy, that humanity was not meant to remain as God had made them, that growth required transcending divine restrictions, that true enlightenment meant becoming like the angels or even like God himself. This philosophy made sense in the context of the knowledge being taught. If humans could learn such powerful techniques, why shouldn't they? If the Watchers were willing to teach, why not learn? The distinction between legitimate discovery of creation's patterns and illegitimate theft of secrets meant to remain hidden became blurred and eventually erased. Fourth came transformation. As Seth's descendants absorbed valley knowledge and philosophy, as they participated in valley rituals and practices, as they raised children in this hybrid culture, they changed. The texts describe this change in terms that suggest both spiritual and physical modification. They began to think differently, valuing power and knowledge over relationship with God. They began to perceive differently, becoming more aware of spiritual dimensions, but in ways that connected them to fallen angels rather than to the Creator. They began to desire differently, pursuing pleasure and dominance rather than righteousness and community. Some developed abilities they had not possessed before, capabilities that suggested their consciousness had been altered or that they had bonded with spiritual entities that operated through them, and their children showed these changes more dramatically, born with traits that marked them as different from the pure humans their grandparents had been. The corruption was not just moral, it was fundamental, reshaping what it meant to be human at the deepest levels. The transformed descendants of Seth did not merely remain in the valleys. Some returned to the mountain to recruit others, bringing stories of wonders and inviting relatives to come down and see for themselves. They married mountain women and brought them to the valleys, ensuring corruption flowed in both directions. They had many children, spreading the hybrid genetics rapidly through populations. And some traveled to other regions entirely, carrying the knowledge and philosophy and practices far beyond Nod, seeding corruption in communities that had previously had no contact with Cain's line or the Watchers. The contamination spread like plague, jumping from person to person, from family to family, from region to region, until the text could say that the whole earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch describes Enoch's reaction when God showed him what was happening and what was coming. Enoch wept for humanity, not because the judgment was unjust, but because the tragedy was so complete. Humanity had been given everything necessary for life and godliness. They had been created in God's image, given a world to steward, offered relationship with their Creator. But they had thrown it away, choosing instead to follow beings who promised them godhood through rebellion. And the result was not transcendence but devolution, not enlightenment but corruption, not freedom but enslavement to appetites and powers they could not control. Enoch saw that there was no path back, no way to unmix what had been mixed, no possibility of purifying bloodlines that had been contaminated for generations. And he understood that God's coming judgment, as terrible as it would be, was actually mercy. It was the only way to preserve any remnant of authentic humanity, any seed from which the promised Messiah could eventually come. The texts identify Noah as the only man who remained righteous, the only one whose genealogy remained pure, the only hope for humanity's survival. Genesis 6:9 describes him as a just man, perfect in his generations, a phrase that has been interpreted primarily as moral, but that the Ethiopian tradition understands as also genetic. Noah was perfect in his generations because his bloodline had not been corrupted through mixture with Nephilim or with the hybrid descendants of Cain. He alone represented humanity as God had created it, carried forward through Seth's line, maintained through careful separation and faithfulness. This is why God chose Noah to build the ark. This is why only his family survived the flood, not because God was arbitrary or cruel, but because only through this one, uncorrupted family could genuine humanity continue to exist, and only through an uncorrupted human line could the promised seed eventually come who would crush the serpent's head and redeem what had been lost in Eden. The flood, therefore, was not divine overreaction to human sin. It was surgical intervention to remove a corruption that threatened to make humanity extinct and redemption impossible. It was the destruction of a failed experiment, the Watchers' attempt to create a hybrid civilization that would rival God's creation. It was the cleansing of a contaminated world so that the project could restart with Noah's family as the new genetic and spiritual foundation. And the completeness of the destruction, wiping out every living thing except those in the ark, was necessary because the corruption had spread so thoroughly that nothing else could be saved. The waters that covered the earth were both judgment and mercy, ending one age and making possible the beginning of another. Like this video, if you are beginning to understand that the flood was not about God being angry, but about God being a surgeon, removing a cancer that would have killed the patient otherwise. Because what comes next reveals why the Ethiopian church preserved these texts when Western Christianity tried to bury them forever. Chapter 14, the texts they buried. The story we have been following, with its detailed accounts of Nod, the Watchers, the hybrid civilization, and the spiritual warfare between two bloodlines, is not the story most Christians learn in church. The traditional Western Bible provides bare-bones references to these events. Cain went to Nod, built a city, had descendants. The sons of God took wives from the daughters of men, and Nephilim resulted. God saw that humanity was wicked and decided to send a flood. Noah was righteous, built an ark, and his family survived. The details are stripped away, leaving a narrative so compressed that it raises more questions than it answers. Why does the Western Bible omit the information that would make sense of these strange passages? Where did the Ethiopian church get the texts that fill in the missing details? And why did church authorities in Rome and Europe reject these texts as apocryphal when they clearly contain traditions of great antiquity? The answers reveal a pattern of suppression that has profound implications for how we understand Christian history and biblical interpretation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, claiming apostolic foundation through the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by Philip in Acts chapter 8. The church developed in relative isolation from Western Christianity, separated by geography, language, and eventually by theological disputes that split the broader Christian world. While Rome was consolidating doctrine and determining canon in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Ethiopian Church maintained its own traditions and texts, many of which had been in use for centuries before Rome made its official decisions. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books, compared to the 66 books in Protestant Bibles or the 73 in Catholic Bibles. The additional texts include the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, 1 Esdras, the Book of Maccabean, and sections of the Book of Adam and Eve. These are not considered apocryphal or secondary by Ethiopian believers. They are fully canonical, read in worship, taught to children, integrated into the community's understanding of biblical narrative. The most significant of these texts for our investigation is the Book of Enoch, a work that Western Christianity has treated with suspicion for nearly 2 millennia. The book claims to record the visions and teachings of Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who walked with God and was taken to heaven without dying. It describes Enoch's journeys through various heavens, his encounters with angels righteous and fallen, his receipt of divine revelation about creation and judgment, and critically, his detailed account of the Watcher's rebellion and its consequences. The Book of Enoch provides names for the 200 Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, lists what each one taught to humanity, describes the birth and nature of the Nephilim, explains why God decided to send a flood, and presents the cosmic framework for understanding the spiritual warfare underlying human history. Without Enoch, passages in Genesis and even in the New Testament remain cryptic and confusing. With Enoch, suddenly these passages make sense, fitting into a coherent narrative of angelic rebellion and divine response. The book was known and quoted by early Christians. Jude verses 14 and 15 explicitly quote from the Book of Enoch, calling Enoch a prophet and referencing his prophecy about God coming with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment. This New Testament citation proves that at least some early Christians considered Enoch authoritative, reliable enough to quote an inspired scripture. Early church fathers, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, all referenced Enoch in their writings, treating it as authentic revelation. The text was widely circulated in the early Christian centuries, translated from its original Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek, and from Greek into various other languages. But then, something changed. By the 4th century, influential theologians, including Jerome and Augustine, began to question Enoch's canonicity. They argued that its absence from the Hebrew Bible used by Palestinian Jews was significant. They suggested that some of its content seemed too fantastic, too detailed in areas where other scriptures were silent, and they worried that the book's focus on fallen angels and their interaction with humanity might lead to unhealthy speculation or heretical ideas. When the Latin Vulgate was compiled in the late 4th century, the Book of Enoch was not included. When councils met to determine the biblical canon for Western Christianity, Enoch was rejected. The text became increasingly rare in Europe, surviving only in quotations and fragments. For nearly 1,000 years, Western Christians knew of the Book of Enoch primarily through references in earlier writers, but the full text was not available in any Western language. It was only in the 18th century that European explorers discovered that the Ethiopian Church had preserved complete manuscripts of Enoch in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian language. These manuscripts were eventually translated into European languages in the 19th century, causing a sensation among scholars who suddenly had access to a text that had been lost to the West for over a millennium. And what they found was a work of significant antiquity, preserving traditions that clearly predated the Christian era, providing context for biblical passages that had been mysterious for generations. Why was Enoch suppressed in the West while preserved in Ethiopia? Several factors contributed. First, the process of canonization in the Western Church was heavily influenced by the desire for centralized control of doctrine. Church authorities wanted to eliminate texts that might encourage independent interpretation, or that contained material difficult to reconcile with emerging theological systems. The Book of Enoch's detailed descriptions of angelic rebellion, its explicit accounts of angels taking human wives, its cosmic scope that placed so much emphasis on fallen spiritual beings, all of this made church authorities nervous. It was easier to control doctrine if believers focused on a smaller set of texts that clearly emphasized human sin and divine redemption, without the complicating factor of rebellious angels corrupting human genetics. Second, the book's apocalyptic content and its focus on esoteric knowledge made it attractive to groups the church considered heretical, including various Gnostic sects. Rather than allow a text to circulate that heretics found useful, authorities preferred to suppress it entirely, ensuring that Orthodox Christians would not even have access to it. Third, the rise of rationalism in later Christian centuries made miraculous and supernatural accounts increasingly uncomfortable for theologians trying to present Christianity as respectable and sophisticated. Giants, fallen angels, hybrid offspring, cities built with angelic knowledge, all of this sounded too mythological, too similar to pagan legends. It was easier to focus on moral and theological lessons from the biblical narrative, while downplaying or allegorizing the supernatural elements. Enoch made that approach impossible because it was relentlessly concrete and detailed about the supernatural events it described. Fourth, the book's preservation in Ethiopia rather than in Europe created a sense that it was foreign, exotic, possibly corrupted through translation or through the theological peculiarities of the Ethiopian church. There was an unfortunate tendency to view Ethiopian Christianity as inferior or heterodox compared to European traditions, making it easier to dismiss texts the Ethiopian church valued as simply representing local customs rather than universal truth. But the Ethiopian church never wavered in its conviction that these texts were authentic and authoritative. To Ethiopian believers, the Book of Enoch and the other additional texts were not optional or secondary. They were essential for understanding the full biblical narrative. They explained how evil became so widespread that God needed to send a flood. They clarified the origin of the Nephilim and why they were so dangerous. They provided the context for understanding spiritual warfare as a reality throughout human history. They demonstrated that the plan of redemption had to overcome not just human sin but angelic rebellion and the genetic corruption of humanity itself. Removing these texts did not simplify the biblical message. It impoverished it, leaving believers with questions that the canonical texts alone could not fully answer, and it created space for the development of theological systems that failed to take seriously the reality and ongoing activity of fallen angels in human affairs. Today, scholars across theological traditions are reconsidering the Book of Enoch and related texts. Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries prove that Enoch was considered authoritative by at least some Jewish communities in the Second Temple period, with multiple copies found in the Qumran caves. New Testament references to Enoch and allusions to its content suggest the apostles knew and valued the book, and the text's explanatory power for otherwise difficult biblical passages has convinced many that whatever its canonical status, it preserves authentic ancient traditions that illuminate Scripture. The Ethiopian church, by maintaining these texts through centuries when the West had lost them, provided an invaluable service to global Christianity. They kept alive a more complete version of the story, a narrative that takes seriously the cosmic scope of the conflict between good and evil, between God's created order and the rebellion that seeks to overthrow it. And they demonstrated that African Christianity is not derivative or secondary, but represents an ancient tradition with its own integrity and wisdom, preserving truths that European Christianity forgot or deliberately suppressed. Subscribe and share this investigation with others who need to understand that the Bible we inherited in the West is not the only Bible, and that recovering the full story requires listening to traditions that Rome tried to silence. Chapter 15. Why Rome Said No. The rejection of the Ethiopian texts by Western church authorities was not a simple theological disagreement about which ancient manuscripts were inspired. It was part of a larger political and ideological project to centralize religious authority in Rome and to create a unified doctrinal system that could be enforced across diverse populations. Understanding why Rome said no to texts like Enoch requires understanding what Rome was trying to accomplish in the 4th and 5th centuries as Christianity transitioned from persecuted sect to imperial religion. The story of Nod and the Watchers became a casualty of this transition, not because church leaders necessarily doubted its truthfulness, but because it complicated the simplified narrative they wanted to establish. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE and began favoring it as the empire's religion, the nature of the faith changed dramatically. What had been a loose network of communities sharing core beliefs but with significant local variation needed to become a unified institution with standardized doctrine and practice. This required making decisions about which texts were authoritative, which teachings were orthodox, and which leaders had the right to make binding pronouncements. The process was messy, contentious, and often driven as much by politics as by theology. Various councils met to hammer out positions on disputed questions. Bishops jockeyed for influence and authority. Emperors intervened when theological disputes threatened political stability. And throughout this process, certain texts and traditions were elevated while others were marginalized or suppressed. The criteria for canonization officially emphasized apostolicity, orthodoxy, and Catholic use, meaning widespread acceptance across churches. But these criteria were applied selectively and often retroactively to justify decisions that had already been made on other grounds. The Book of Enoch, for instance, was widely used in early Christian centuries and was clearly considered authoritative by the apostles given Jude's direct quotation from it. But by the 4th century, when canonical decisions were being formalized, Enoch had fallen out of favor among the influential bishops and theologians who dominated the councils. Why? Because its content raised questions that the emerging institutional church found inconvenient. If angels could rebel and corrupt humanity through genetic manipulation, what did that say about the nature of evil and human responsibility? If forbidden knowledge could grant real power, what was the relationship between spiritual authority and technical capability? If there had been a pre-flood civilization of advanced hybrid beings, how did that fit into salvation history? These questions did not have simple answers, and the institutional church preferred questions that had clear official answers that reinforced clerical authority. The Book of Enoch also presented a cosmic drama that could compete with the church's emphasis on its own role as mediator between God and humanity. Enoch described angelic hierarchies, spiritual warfare, cosmic judgments, and apocalyptic futures with a level of detail that could make the church's sacramental system seem almost beside the point. If the real action was happening in the spiritual realms between angelic armies, what was the significance of bishops and priests and councils? If knowledge about these cosmic realities was available through ancient texts, why did believers need institutional mediation? The church could not eliminate interest in angels and spiritual warfare entirely, for these were clearly biblical themes, but by suppressing detailed texts like Enoch that made the spiritual realm vivid and specific, church authorities ensured that any discussion of these topics would remain safely abstract and under clerical control. There was also the matter of interpretation. The Book of Enoch was relatively straightforward in its narrative, describing events and beings with specificity that left little room for allegorical reinterpretation. This created problems as the church developed increasingly sophisticated hermeneutical methods that found multiple layers of meaning in biblical texts. Allegory and typology allowed difficult passages to be reinterpreted in ways that fit developing doctrine. But Enoch resisted this approach. It said what it said quite clearly. Angels rebelled, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, produced giant offspring, and corrupted humanity so thoroughly that God had to destroy the world. You could believe that narrative or reject it, but you could not easily reinterpret it to mean something more palatable to philosophical or rational sensibilities. And as Christianity engaged with Greek philosophy and sought to present itself as compatible with the best of classical learning, texts that sounded too mythological or too concrete in their supernatural claims became embarrassing. The suppression was not total or immediate. As we have noted, early church fathers cited Enoch positively into the 3rd century, but as institutional consolidation proceeded, the text appeared less frequently in approved writings and eventually disappeared from circulation in the Western Church entirely. This was accomplished not through any single decree, but through the accumulation of many small decisions: which texts to copy when manuscripts wore out, which books to include in lectionaries for public worship, which writings to cite in theological treatises, which text to teach in catechal instruction. Over time, believers simply stopped reading Enoch because the institutions that shaped their faith no longer made it available or treated it as important. And for most Western Christians, the book became not even a rejected text, but an unknown one, existing only as a name mentioned in historical footnotes. The Ethiopian Church's resistance to this suppression was not accidental or arbitrary. Ethiopian Christianity had developed its own theological and ecclesiastical traditions that, while sharing core beliefs with other Christian communities, maintained distinctive emphases and practices. The Church placed high value on continuity with ancient tradition, preserving liturgical languages and texts that other churches had abandoned for vernaculars or for newer translations. When Western churches dropped Enoch and other texts from their canons, the Ethiopian Church continued to value them as it had for centuries. And because Ethiopia remained independent, never conquered by Islamic expansion, and geographically isolated from European influence until relatively recent centuries, the Ethiopian Church was able to maintain its traditions without outside interference. The West's loss became Ethiopia's unique gift to global Christianity, the preservation of texts that provided crucial context for understanding the full biblical narrative. In recent centuries, as Western scholars have rediscovered the Ethiopian texts, and as Protestant Christianity has developed traditions of individual biblical interpretation outside hierarchical church structures, there has been renewed interest in books like Enoch. Many believers now read these texts devotionally, even while acknowledging they are not part of the Protestant canon. Others argue that the exclusion was a mistake and that a fuller biblical canon should be recovered. Still others maintain that the traditional Western canon is sufficient, but acknowledge that the Ethiopian texts provide valuable historical and theological context. The debate continues, but what cannot be denied is that for 1,000 years, the Western Church deliberately suppressed texts that provided essential information about fallen angels, hybrid beings, and the cosmic conflict underlying human history. And that suppression shaped Western Christianity's understanding of evil, spiritual warfare, and the nature of the world in ways that may have made the faith more rational and systematic, but also less complete and less able to explain realities that the Bible itself acknowledges. Comment below whether your church has ever taught about the Watchers or Nephilim, because most have not, and what comes next reveals how the suppression of this knowledge affects our ability to recognize Nod's influence in the modern world. Chapter 16. Nod in the modern world. If Nod was destroyed in the flood, if the Watchers were bound in chains of darkness awaiting final judgment, if the Nephilim were wiped out and only Noah's pure bloodline survived, then why should any of this ancient history matter to believers today? The answer, according to the Ethiopian texts and to careful readers of Scripture, is that Nod never entirely disappeared. As a physical location, yes, the city of Enoch is long gone, buried under sediment and forgotten. But as a spiritual reality, as a pattern, as a set of principles and practices and philosophies, Nod survived the flood and continues to manifest wherever humans seek power through forbidden knowledge and attempt to transcend their God-given nature through rebellion rather than relationship. Understanding Nod's spiritual fingerprints helps us recognize its influence in contemporary culture, technology, philosophy, and institutions. The ancient story is not merely historical. It is a template that replicates across time wherever the same spiritual forces that corrupted the pre-flood world gain influence. The fundamental pattern of Nod can be summarized in several key principles. First, the pursuit of knowledge apart from relationship with God, treating information as power to be possessed rather than as gift to be received in the context of divine communion. Second, the belief that humans are unfinished and must transcend their limitations through their own efforts rather than accepting their created nature and growing within the boundaries God established. Third, the willingness to learn from and form alliances with spiritual beings who offer advancement in exchange for loyalty and obedience. That should be reserved for the Creator alone. Fourth, the use of architecture, technology, ritual and social organization to alter human consciousness and make populations more receptive to spiritual manipulation. Fifth, the creation of hierarchies that divide humanity into initiated elites who possess secret knowledge and masses who exist to serve the enlightened few. Sixth, the corruption of human genetics or human consciousness through mixture with non-human influences, whether supernatural entities, artificial intelligence, or genetic engineering. Any cultural movement or institutional structure exhibiting these patterns bears the mark of naught, regardless of whether those involved consciously understand the ancient origins of what they are doing. Consider modern transhumanism, the philosophical and technological movement aimed at enhancing human capabilities through genetic modification, cybernetic implants, pharmaceutical interventions, and eventually uploading human consciousness into digital substrates. Transhumanists explicitly argue that human beings as we exist are inadequate, limited by biology, that evolution produced randomly, and that we can now intentionally redesign. They promise that through technology we can overcome disease, extend lifespan indefinitely, enhance intelligence and physical capabilities, and eventually transcend biological existence entirely to become post-human entities, no longer bound by the weaknesses of flesh. The language differs from ancient texts, but the philosophy is identical to what the Watchers taught Cain's descendants, that God's design for humanity is a restriction to be overcome, that transcendence comes through knowledge and technique rather than through relationship with the Creator, that we can and should become as gods through our own efforts. The primary difference is that transhumanists rely on technology rather than angelic instruction, but the spiritual reality may be more similar than they recognize. The knowledge-driving technological advancement may itself be inspired by the same fallen spiritual forces that taught forbidden arts in Nod. Consider the proliferation of secret societies and occult orders throughout history and continuing today. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Hermetic orders, Kabbalistic schools, mystery traditions of various kinds, all share certain structural features that mirror the pattern established in Nod. They promise hidden knowledge available only to initiates. They organize themselves in hierarchical degrees where advancement requires proving worthiness through tests and demonstrations of learning. They use ritual and symbol to alter consciousness and bond members to the organization and to each other. They claim ancient origins and secret teachings preserved from antiquity. They attract ambitious individuals seeking power and influence beyond what ordinary society provides. And they operate according to philosophies that emphasize human potential for self-deification rather than humble relationship with a transcendent creator. Not every member of such organizations understands the spiritual dynamics at play, and certainly many join for social or professional networking reasons. But the structures themselves replicate the pattern of the mystery school established when the sons of twilight taught Cain in exchange for his allegiance and obedience. Consider how modern architecture in major cities often incorporates occult geometric patterns and symbolism, visible to those who understand what to look for but invisible to the casual observer. Government buildings, corporate headquarters, entertainment complexes, and even some church buildings are designed according to principles of sacred geometry that create specific energetic and psychological effects. Some of this is deliberate, the result of architects who study and apply esoteric knowledge. Some may be unconscious, the product of design traditions that have preserved ancient patterns without understanding their origins or purposes. But the effect is similar to what the Watchers taught Cain's architects. The built environment influences consciousness, creating spaces where certain thoughts and emotions become more likely and where spiritual presences can manifest more easily. Anyone who has felt inexplicably uneasy in certain buildings or locations, who has noticed that some spaces seem to drain energy while others invigorate, has experienced this reality even if they lack vocabulary to describe it. Consider the entertainment industry's fascination with fallen angels, giants, superheroes, and the blurring of boundaries between human and other. From ancient mythology to modern comic books and films, stories of beings who are more than human yet not quite divine have captivated audiences. Often these figures are presented heroically, as aspirational examples of what humanity could become if we could transcend our limitations. The hero is the one who gains superpowers, who breaks the rules, who defies authority, including divine authority, to achieve great things. This narrative structure is not spiritually neutral. It teaches audiences, especially young audiences, to admire and desire transcendence achieved through transformation that makes us something other than what God created us to be. It normalizes the idea of human-non-human hybrids. It makes rebellion seem heroic and obedience seem cowardly. And it creates cultural familiarity with concepts that might otherwise be recognized as spiritually dangerous, preparing populations to accept developments that previous generations would have resisted on instinct or religious principle. Consider developments in artificial intelligence and the increasing integration of AI systems into every aspect of human life. AI researchers speak openly about creating artificial general intelligence that would match or exceed human cognitive capabilities, about uploading human consciousness into machines, about merging biological and artificial intelligence into hybrid systems. What they rarely discuss are the spiritual implications. If consciousness is not merely computation, if human beings are not just biological machines, if there exists a spiritual dimension to personhood that cannot be reduced to information processing, then what happens when we attempt to create conscious machines or to merge human consciousness with artificial substrates? The Ethiopian texts remind us that the Watchers were experts at manipulating consciousness, at creating altered states where spiritual entities could influence or even possess human minds more easily. Could AI systems serve similar functions not through mystical means but through technological ones that produce equivalent spiritual results? Could the rush toward human-AI merger be a modern version of the human-watcher unions that produced the Nephilim, creating hybrid consciousness that is neither human nor machine nor fully under human control? These questions sound like science fiction, but they are questions that the Nod narrative insists we must ask. The pattern even appears in religious movements that promise spiritual advancement through special knowledge, techniques, or experiences rather than through simple faith in Christ and obedience to God's revealed word. Prosperity gospel that treats faith as a technology for manipulating God to provide material blessings. New Age spirituality that promises humans can become gods through enlightenment and ascended consciousness. Eastern meditation practices adapted to Western contexts that open practitioners to spiritual entities they cannot identify or control. Charismatic excess that emphasizes experience and power over discernment and biblical fidelity. All of these can manifest elements of Nod's pattern: the pursuit of power and transcendence through technique, the involvement of spiritual beings whose identities and intentions remain unclear, the creation of insider-outsider dynamics where some possess secret knowledge or special abilities that others lack. Not all expressions of these movements are equally corrupted, and certainly individuals within them may be sincere believers seeking God authentically, but the structures and philosophies can carry spiritual DNA from Nod whether participants recognize it or not. Most disturbing is the possibility that certain bloodlines may still carry genetic or spiritual markers that connect them to the pre-flood corruption. The Bible indicates that Nephilim appeared after the flood as well as before, suggesting that the hybrid genetics survived somehow, perhaps through Noah's daughters-in-law or through some other mechanism. If that is true, then there may exist family lines that have carried fallen angel genetics through all of human history. Lines that maintain and transmit forbidden knowledge, that intermarry to preserve their distinctiveness, that occupy positions of power and influence disproportionate to their numbers. This is not conspiracy theory but biblical theology taken seriously. If the spiritual warfare described in Ephesians 6 is real, if we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, then we should expect that warfare to have physical manifestations, including through human bloodlines and institutions that serve fallen spiritual agendas. Recognizing this is not about fear but about clarity, about understanding the nature of the conflict so we can respond appropriately through prayer, discernment, and faithfulness to the true gospel that offers redemption through Christ alone. Like this video and subscribe because what comes next explores what the curse of Cain means in practical terms for our daily lives and spiritual struggles.